Welcome. Um, my presentation is on stormwater best management practices, and we're going to look specifically at post-construction BMPs and a cost comparison of maintenance versus repair, and kind of how that how if we put off maintenance, then we're going to end up spending the money or even some more on the repair side. So if we'll go to the next slide, slide number 3 says, why do we have rain gardens in Missouri? And here's some photos of what we typically think of, at least John Q. Public does when we talk about rain gardens. And sometimes rain gardens kind of get the all-encompassing thought on stormwater and stormwater BMPs. And so we think of the biodiversity, we think of pollinator habitat, we think of some of the nice native plants that grow, and the flowers and stuff that are associated with some of these rain gardens. But in reality, if we go to the next slide, we look more at why we have rain gardens, or more specifically, stormwater treatment systems in St. Louis. And it comes along more along the lines of these photos, where in St. Louis City and St. Louis County specifically, under the MSD's footprint, we were having issues with basement backups. We were having issues with point of discharge relief and overflows from a combined storm and sanitary sewer system, where storm surges were bringing massive amounts of water into pipes that were made to handle the sanitary sewer and not necessarily the storm surges. Next slide is a couple more examples of that, with just some manhole lids being blown off, and we see in the photo on the right the leaking of this combined sewer water that is both storm and sanitary, hitting. It looks like some flood water down the way, but I'm guessing that flood water is gonna touch a native lake or stream and make its way into the two biggest rivers in North America here with the Missouri and the Mississippi. The next slide's got some text on it that just kind of goes over the St. Louis City and St. Louis County specific information. That we had a combined storm and wastewater sewer system, or sanitary sewer system. It's an old infrastructure, and that was built for an old environment. The lack of stormwater absorption really wasn't a problem when we were underdeveloped here in the city and in the county. We had plenty of green space. We had plenty of areas for this water, rainwater, to absorb into the natural hydrological system. Extra runoff did enter the combined sewer, but new construction kind of changed the environment here. We started adding more roofs, more parking lots. The stormwater runoff from these hardscapes increased with less open ground to provide absorption, and that meant that more rainwater was headed into the combined sewer system. So this additional runoff into the old and combined infrastructure equaled an overcharged system. The original plan for the overcharged system, actually before MSD's inception, was, when there were backups, the original solution was to create these overflow relief points, where they would intentionally have areas that would overflow this combined water, and that would lessen the backups into the basements and the streets. But that was causing a major issue in that we were providing this wastewater pollution into, like I said, the largest river system in North America. So the new solution is to separate the storm and the sanitary sewers, and then add in some of the screen infrastructure and these post-construction BMPs. Next slide. For the folks that are familiar with the consent decree, this was a lawsuit that was entered into with the EPA, the state of Missouri, and the Missouri Coalition for Environment Foundation against the Metropolitan Sewer District. The consent decree was kind of the resolution of this lawsuit. And if we go to the next slide, it was a 2007 lawsuit. Again, the major problem there was these overflows, these points of overcharge relief. They all predated MSD's creation, like I said. And so as part of this consent decree, in the resolution of this lawsuit from 1992 to 2007, MSD showed that they had spent $2.3 billion with a B dollars to remove over 300 of these overflow points, with less than 400 remaining. So they were about the halfway point. By the time we got to the resolution and the consent decree's inception in August of 2011, the settlement of the consent decree asked the MSD to spend another $4.7 billion over the next 23 years to address these overflows, as well as make other improvements, the effective date being April 27th of 2012. For those of you with sleeping problems, there's a website link there to the actual consent decree revisions and reports. Feel free to check those out if you're up late one night, and hopefully it'll knock you out pretty quick. Next slide. So that talks a little bit about the consent decree. Obviously covers MSD's footprint, which is St. Louis City and most of St. Louis County. But here out in St. Charles County, we're still talking stormwater, and this more falls under the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, under the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems. And apparently MSSS was too much of a mouthful, so we've shortened that to MS4 for the 4 S's there in the acronym. Again, this is for storm sewer systems. It creates a system that is owned and operated by a public entity, which could be a city, a township, an entire county. Public entity could be a highway department or a public university or education center, something like that. And these systems are designed for use in collecting or conveying stormwater, which is not part of a combined sewer and not part of a publicly owned treatment works. So it's not headed to a water treatment facility. These systems are separate. And again, this is trying to keep rainwater separate from wastewater. And that's where we end up with a lot of this BMP talk outside of MSD's footprint, is because these other municipalities or these other public entities are falling under a need for an MS4 permit under the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. Again, another website there with good information on the MS4 program. So next slide. We're going to cover a little bit of a history on BMPs. Hopefully this is a review to most people here, but in case there's new folks or some continuing ed people that are picking this up for the first time, we're going to cover BMP types, and these are post-construction BMPs that we're going to talk about, stormwater treatment, best management practices, and then we're going to talk kind of about how they're built, how they're maintained, and where the money is going to be spent on the maintenance end, because in St. Louis City and St. Louis County within MSD's jurisdiction, these facilities, once they're implemented, are to be maintained and continued in perpetuity. So once the porous pavement goes in, it has to stay porous pavement. You can't just come in, rip it out, and put in regular asphalt or seal over the top of it without then collecting that storm water and putting it into a new system. Or if you're adding to a building, you can certainly take out a rain garden if you're adding a wing to a building. But the volume of water that rain garden treated before needs to be factored into the new construction of the new wing of the building, with a new stormwater treatment system that is going to pick up where the other one left off and then handle all of the new runoff from the new wing. So we're going to cover some details in a minute on biodetention basins, which are rain gardens, porous pavement, retention basins, which are wet ponds, swales, amended soils, level spreaders, and then underground stuff like hydrodynamic separators, stormwater quality filter systems, underground detention, and some stormwater quality storage systems. So next slide. We're also going to talk about how BMPs work. What is their intent? How are they designed? How are they constructed? And then we'll get into the maintenance piece. So next slide. So let's look at the intent of these post-construction BMPs. One of the major intents of this is to filter that stormwater runoff, to keep pollutants out of the rivers, lakes, and streams that are in our region, and to gather that pollutant, whether that's physical trash, styrofoam cups, cigarette butts, or whether it's like more of a chemical pollutant. And so for the filtration piece, we've got active and passive removal of pollutants from the water. We achieve this with plants, filter materials such as sand and gravel, and mechanical means. Various BMPs provide differing levels of filtration and different types of filtration, and we'll get into that with some of these specific BMPs when we start looking at how they work. One of the other intents of the post-construction BMPs is to allow for percolation or infiltration, and that is sending water back into the ground to assume the natural hydrological system function. BMPs, specific BMPs may or may not allow for this percolation or infiltration. You'll see in some of the pictures that we've got of these stormwater detention facilities, these underground detention vaults. It's concrete wall on all 6 sides. So there's no way that water that enters that vault is actually going to make it back into the ground out of that specific BMP, whereas other types of BMPs, some of them specifically like amended soils, are made to allow for that percolation and infiltration. And then we want to look at speed reduction, and this is detention versus retention conversation. We can reduce speed 2 ways. We can slow the velocity of flowing water to allow those solids to settle, reducing turbidity at the point of discharge into lakes, rivers, and streams. And then we can also, on the retention side, is that we can slow the release of water into those rivers, lakes, and streams to reduce flash flooding. So think of on the detention side like a stormwater pond, where you're actually collecting the water, you're letting it sit, you're letting the solids settle out of it, and then the only way for it to overflow out of that pond is through the outlet structure or up over a high bank or something like that, where you're taking the cleanest water off the top of the water column, and that reduces turbidity, at that point where it's being released. And your retention, think of that as your basins that fill up and start to fill up above the surface of the rain garden, the actual floor of the rain garden. It fills up and pools water above it, but then at that point it then filters back down through and is released, and is kind of metered out of the system, and that helps to reduce flash flooding. . Next slide. Underground components are typically prefabricated systems with specified installation procedures. These are frequently found in concert with other BMPs. So you've got multiple components linked together. You know, you might have porous pavement that then you know, overflows into underground detention that then goes into a stormwater filter. Maybe there's an HDS linked in there somewhere. But a lot of times on larger systems where you have underground, you have multiple components that are linked together. Smaller sites, you might end up with like a single hydrodynamic separator, which is an underground piece. But again, larger sites, you typically are going to find multiple components linked together. Because one will filter, another will allow for percolation, one will allow for detention. And so you're kind of hitting different phases of cleaning that water and releasing it slowly back into the system. So again, more examples, these hydrodynamic separators are underground facilities, water quality filters, stormwater quality, and stormwater detention vaults. Next slide, I believe, has some photos. So here's some underground detention. Again, it's just basically a pretty simple system where water is piped in. You know, this allows for the use of the ground space above that. So typically you're going to end up with a parking lot above this area so that the site can be utilized, you know, for whatever its intent is, its purpose, but it still allow for the runoff from that new parking lot to be captured, to be filtered, and to be metered slowly back out into either that combined sewer system or back out into directly into rivers, lakes, and streams. Next slide is some additional photos. On the left, we have hydrodynamic separator. You can see the red arrow there on the left shows water coming into the HDS unit. If you follow that pipe down, you see there's a red kind of spiral that goes down. So water comes into these HDS units. It swirls to drop solids out and collect those at the bottom. It also, at this point, allows oils to float up to the top and be contained in a certain area of this structure. And then the clean water, now that the oil has been separated off the top, the sediment has been spun off the side, it actually gets pushed up through another grate and another filter on the side to where it goes up and out to the right on this photo, where that kind of green or blue arrow is pointing towards the middle of the slide. And then we have some other examples of underground. We've got the yellow contact domes, and those are, again, underground detention. They do allow for some percolation and some filtering of water back in there. The bottom center is a photo of some perlite filters, and we'll see that those, we'll see a better picture of those here later. That's a filter system. And then on the bottom right, we have a stormwater vault. And that again is just a large vault area where water comes in. It's allowed for the solids to settle out of it before it's kind of metered back out. So it's a storage, but that type of facility would not allow for any additional percolation because it's solid on on all sides. All right, next slide. We basically covered this, that these are prefabricated systems. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was the underground stuff. And then now we're going to look at porous pavement, which is an above ground system. This porous pavement requires a specialty application of concrete or asphalt materials that have larger aggregate sizes, less sand, and a finishing that does not seal the open spaces between the aggregates. We have examples throughout the region of porous concrete, porous asphalt, and these interlocking paver systems that are installed with filter beds and under drains for all of them. And the interlocking pavers are solid brick pavers that have some sort of additional gaps or openings, either in the centers of them, like we'll see in a couple of pictures, or the bricks lay in such a way that that there's a wider gap in between the bricks. Those are filled with a wider grade or a larger grade rock to allow water to enter in between those gaps and enter that filter bed and under drain. New pavement areas, we see these porous pavements going in as new pavement, or we see it as replacing existing conventional pavement. If the slope of the site, leads to the water being pushed towards an existing conventional pavement, that area can be replaced, excavated, and this porous installed. We've seen sidewalks, parking spaces, driveways, patios. I've seen some interlocking paver patios, that the gutter system runs directly onto. And the porous pavement filters and slows stormwater. Sometimes they allow for infiltration, but with our good Missouri clay here, infiltration is kind of one of those nice to haves, but maybe we're just kind of hopeful that it happens, but we're not fully expecting it. So next slide. Here's some porous in action. If you look at the street lights there, the parking lights, you can tell that it's raining pretty good. And then that kind of the middle of the photo here, the closest to us in the foreground, that lighter gray area is porous asphalt. The darker black that is in the immediate, bottom of the photo, that's conventional asphalt. And if you look past this first row of parking spaces, you can see some conventional asphalt with a heavy sheen of water on it. And so the water is collecting on that conventional and running towards the porous. And as you can see, kind of in the bottom right of that photo, you can see some water starting to pool there on the porous as it's trying to make its way into those pores. But the middle part is still, the surface is still dry. There's no standing water on it. And so that means that the rainwater that's hitting that directly is already, making its way into the filter. And, as we see stuff kind of pool up there, like I said in the bottom right, then that water pools and kind of overflows onto the rest of the porous and continues to infiltrate in between those pores. Next slide. So porous pavement's put down with specialty machines. This is a machine that is doing some specialty scree work on the porous concrete, so as not to overfinish it, so as not to run one or two more passes on it because it doesn't look quite right. It just doesn't have that nice look to it. This machine is already set up to do that in just a single pass with both rollers, so that it's not over finishing and it's not closing those pores at the surface. Top right, we can see some water flowing through some porous concrete, and then we've got a cutaway design that shows pavers with some joint, that permeable joint material that I was talking about. Goes in between the joints of the pavers, allows water to come through that into a couple different layers of gravel to be filtered, and then into your under drain and out of the system. I will say that porous pavement is very, very good at collecting cigarette butts, and especially interlocking pavers. Those gaps are just wide enough to catch a cigarette butt, and so we'll talk about that a little bit with maintenance, but maybe something to consider if you're designing an area. I guess expect, know your audience for what the use is going to be. So next slide. Here's some interlocking pavers on the left. We have a paver system or a porous concrete system in the middle that is actually more like pattern stamped concrete, but it has openings in the center. I believe this is out at the Botanical Gardens. And we're starting to see more of this start to pop up, at least on the coast and in some design work that we've seen, where they're trying to get grass to kind of grow in between those pavers and those in that native soil that's in between those pavers. And you get almost like a kind of a half turf look to a parking area. So we'll see how well that comes across here in Missouri with our full 4 seasons. And sometimes we get all 4 seasons in a month. So we'll see how well something like that works. And then on the right, we have a porous asphalt divided line right there on the parking stripe. So on the left side of that parking stripe is the porous, and on the right side is the conventional that has been fully sealed and is fairly impenetrable by water. So next slide. Talk a minute about retention, which are wet ponds. Retention ponds, they're easy to excavate. They do require installation of an outfall structure that regulates pool depth and releases water at a low flow and high flow levels. These are pretty basic. They're the oldest form of stormwater treatment system in the region. It's for sediment and water storage, or sedimentation and water storage. So it allows, like I said, it allows those solids to kind of settle out of the water. And again, when we get into maintenance and we get into repair work, just like any other filter, the furnace filter in your house or the oil filter in your truck or your car, if it's made to filter stuff out, then once that filter gets full, then we need to either clean the filter or replace the filter. And same thing with ponds. I mean, they're there to collect and allow for sedimentation, for that cleaner water out of the water column to leave. And so at some point that pond is going to sediment in, and we're going to need to do some maintenance and repair to it. This is one of the only BMPs that really heavily contributes to the hydrological cycle through evaporation, because it allows a large surface of water, surface area of water to heat up and evaporate and work its way back into the natural hydrological cycle. These ponds may or may not have pretreatment forebays, which allow for additional sediment collection and additional filtration of trash. Forebays are nice because then that leaves you a single location that you need to maintain when it becomes silted in, instead of the entire pond as a whole. Next slide, the photo of a stormwater pond here in the region, and some of the difficulties that come with it. On the left-hand side of this photo is behind some of those cattails is a rock forebay. If you look kind of center left towards the back of the pond, you can see another rock wall there that has a forebay behind it. So those are the 2 points at which water comes into this pond. So trash is collected there behind those rock walls. Heavy sediment is typically deposited right there in that forebay, so it makes it a little bit easier for maintenance as far as you don't have to lower the pond level and dredge the whole thing out if you can work right there in the forebay. But due to some construction codes, we typically see cattails in these things because there is a safety bench. The water doesn't immediately go to 6 foot deep. There's typically a 10-foot wide bench around the edge of these things, so that you can't wander in and drown without really realizing you're into some water. So it's a gradual slope, and that's prime area for cattails. So we'll discuss that in maintenance. Next slide. Here's a quick look at some construction outlet structures there. You can see low flow points, which allow for a pool height. And then the structure on the right-hand side has kind of got a T-shaped overflow to where, as water level continues to go up and up and up, then it allows more and more water in. And typically the top of these things are graded to where it's an emergency overflow, that if the pond is absolutely full, then everything can dump into these things and move its way through the outlet structure. Okay, so I think the last one we're going to talk here on how they work is rain gardens. These are enclosed basins with filter beds, which are gravel and sand. They have an underdrain. They have additional filter media layer, which is the engineered rain garden soil, where native plants with extensive root systems are planted. Everybody should be fairly familiar with these systems, also known as biodetention basins. If we go to the next slide. These are typically set apart by the use of native plants. These are filters that slow the stormwater and sometimes hold stormwater back, and that's through a perched underdrain. They do allow for percolation at some point, and these are popular BMP components as they can be aesthetically pleasing and viable alternatives to traditional landscape beds. Additionally, we get those ecological benefits that we originally, talked about on that very first slide, where we have the native plants, we have the biodiversity. A lot of different native plants bloom at different times. Some of them are very, very pretty flowers, and they look really nice. Some of the grasses, look really nice, and just kind of depends on the aesthetic look that you're looking for. But they do also benefit the pollinators, the birds, and other wildlife. So if we go to the next slide, here's a good rain garden photo. Oh no, wait, sorry, let's go next slide. There it is, there's that rain garden. We'll get into some details on this project a little bit later, but this is what happens whenever you have a basin, you don't maintain it, you decide it looks like crap, and so you pay somebody to come in, rip it out, and put down sod, and then MSD folks come by to look for their routine inspections and say, where's your rain garden? We have to go back in and repair things. And so this is always a good comparison of the slide there that I like to show folks. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at the construction of rain gardens here quickly. Basically, you dig the excavation, you've got the native soil underneath. Again, as you can see here, this is in South County. We've got some nice Missouri clay there. It was sprinkling on us when we were excavating this and getting it wrapped in fabric, and so it was already starting to pool a little bit of water in that clay. The excavation on the bottom of these is typically not completely flat, not skimmed all the way clean. They call it ripping or tilling, where you take the tooth of the excavator bucket and you kind of chunk up the bottom, hoping to allow for some additional infiltration if you can break up some of that clay. You wrap the sides in filter fabric, and then we start installing the gravel layers. The middle photo there is a 3/4 inch gravel. We use Merrimack gravel or natural gravel, and not a limestone, because the limestone tended to either the water was moving through it too fast and it was starting to erode limestone like it typically does, or the water wasn't moving through it fast enough and there was enough dust and stuff in the limestone layers that it was almost creating like a cement block. So we use a Merrimack gravel, again 3/4 on the bottom. Then that's typically 6 to 8 to 10 inches, depends on your drawings. Then you have a layer of pea gravel, 3/8 inch pea gravel. Again, Merrimack, that's what's going in on the right-hand side. If you go to the next slide, we have a layer of concrete sand or crushed sand, manufactured sand. We try not to use natural sand because it has a tendency, that natural sand, to kind of line itself up with those. The natural sand particles are more rounded as they've kind of been rolled across the bottom of rivers and stuff. And so it kind of fits together and makes almost like a seal, whereas this crushed sand is very jagged. It's, you know, it's very gritty feeling if you rub it between your fingers, and that allows for the way that it sits to allow water to work its way through that and, you know, not create a seal. This particular basin did call for the underdrain to go on top of the sand layer and directly into the outlet structure without a perch. You know, some of these, we actually see that underdrain that's on the left-hand side going in under the sand layer or in that first pea gravel layer, and then perching itself up. So it has to raise itself up to go into that outlet structure, which allows for some additional holding of water. And then the last 30 to 36 inches of the excavation is going to be that engineered rain garden soil. It's a high sand content, low clay. I think I've got a slide on that in a minute. And then after the rain garden soil goes in, then we top it off with some more mulch layer. Everybody, for the most part, is moving to a hardscape mulch, so a rock mulch. Again, whether it's that 3/8 inch Merrimack pea gravel. This was actually a little bit larger, larger coarse rock, a natural rock, but it was more decorative. That's what they had across a couple other basins, and so they wanted to match. And then, of course, we always protect the basin. So we've got some straw mat down around the sides to protect it from silting in and from silt, you know, washing in and clogging up the basin during the construction process. Next slide. Then we get to go through and plant all the native plants that are prescribed. Most of the time, these are deep cell plugs. You get 38 to a tray, and you running and gunning with the augers. If you're going to put in like a wood mulch, I would plant first, then put the mulch down. If you're going to do pea gravel mulch, I would mulch first and then plant. That way you're not crushing the plants when you're throwing the mulch in there. Next slide is a completed basin, again with some additional protection around the outside. This one has not been mulched yet. I think this one was going to get a hardwood mulch that was going to be blown in. And next slide is one where we should all be familiar with the root systems there on the native plants. You know, those are extending very deep into that engineered soil, so it has more time to absorb water, more time to filter out some of those pollutants that are working their way through the filter, and so that's why we're using native plants in these basins. Next slide. So we've got a couple other BMPs. Filter strips are above ground areas with plants that catch debris. They slow the velocity of water running across the surface, and they allow for additional infiltration. Swales are very similar to filter strips, but they're more of a dedicated function of channeling stormwater between components. So you might have a swale that leads, you know, off of, say there's porous pavement and it's got an overflow that anything that doesn't fall into the porous pavement goes through a curb cut, then it goes into a swale and gets directed into a rain garden. So your first line of defense there, or your first function is the porous pavement. Anything that is additional water, like what we're probably getting outside right now, that is going to run off of that pavement, gets directed to a basin, you know, through these swales. Amended soils we're starting to see more and more of. This is the addition of organic material, which is compost, to an area of native soil that will increase the infiltration of water into that area of native soil. So you till up the native soil, you lay down a thick layer of compost, you till that compost in until you have some nice planting soil. A lot of times we see sod going down on top of this, or even some native like prairie seeding and stuff like that, where this soil now, instead of being a heavy clay mix, has got that organic material mixed in, which allows for additional pore space, allows for those roots to kind of move through, and allows for that water to filter through. Bubble spreaders are above ground systems that dissipate the velocity of water runoff to prevent erosion and allow for infiltration and sediment removal. So next slide. So we've talked about the intent, and we've talked about the design, we've talked about the construction. So why do BMPs fail? Typically, the intent and the design don't cause BMPs to fail, although I will say poorly designed systems do require more frequent maintenance to ensure performance to the level that it was designed. We have seen some flawed designs lead to failure, and then, like we talked about, these BMPs that are mainly filters are designed to eventually fail without maintenance, just like just like we said, the furnace filter in your house or the oil filter in your car. These things are made to accumulate, whether it's silt in the pond or a forebay, or it's trash in a rain garden. That's stuff that needs to go through and be cleaned out because that's being kept out of the rivers, lakes, and streams, or the combined sewer systems that we have. Sometimes we see construction failures that lead to failures of the BMP, not following the plans. That could be anything from basin depth to under-drain connections. Inadequate materials. We talked a little bit about that sharp sand versus the natural sand in the rain garden, whether that's in the filter media itself, like the engineered rain garden soil, or in that sand layer. That rounded sand just tends to kind of stack itself really nice and neat and not allow for good pore space and good porosity for that water to move through. We did cover not protecting silt for the remainder of or not protecting from silt for the remainder of the construction phase. That's probably the number one construction failure that we see, is that a component is not being protected during the rest of construction. We talked about overfinishing porous pavement. We're not seeing that too much anymore, but early on in the early use of porous pavement, you had guys that just, it didn't look right. It needed one more pass with the roller. It needed one more skim across the top of that concrete because it just didn't look quite right. And that one more pass, or that one more, just a little bit of extra work ended up closing up pores, and the porous pavement just didn't work as well as it should. We're seeing a lot of that go away as more and more companies that are installing porous pavement are doing it correctly, and they're more familiar with it. Leaking wet ponds is a typical construction failure, and I wouldn't even say that's a failure. That's something that we see sometimes, just that the outlet pipe is encased in gravel, and water's going to do what water wants to do, and sometimes it'll find a way to get alongside that pipe instead of in it, and then you've got a leak where your pond level is not quite as high as it needs to be. All right, next slide. Oh yeah, here's the details on that bioretention and organic filter criteria. 60% minimum sand by volume. Clay should be less than 10%. Typically, one of the soil texture analysis that we come back and see is that it's called loamy sand. We see typically 80+% sand, less than 10% silt, less than 10% clay. And you should be in good shape. I think there's also some organic material in there that they allow for. So if it's not, if you've got another component in there, organic material is just fine. Next slide. Kind of a culmination of everything we were talking about. You can see some of the protection going in. These basins were covered with filter fabric during the rest of the construction. Just to keep material off of the basin surface, so it wasn't getting into that media, and it wasn't causing any clogging issues. Next slide. Okay. So failure of BMPs, maintenance failures. We'll talk about the BMP specific maintenance that is needed to ensure performance. And, kind of the whole point of this is without maintenance, BMP failure is inevitable. In your underground system, you can get accumulation of silt, you can get clogging or dirtying of filters, broken, damaged, or blocked components. We were looking at a system it's been about a year now ago, and they couldn't figure out why everything was rusting, and it's an underground detention, and it shouldn't be holding this much water. And so for some reason, the tour, the inspection started at the top end of the system. We worked our way down to the outlet structure, and it turned out that the outlet structure had a weir in it that had a hole drilled in the weir that was to meter water out of this underground system. And the hole was the exact size of an extra large Subway cup. And there was a cup wedged in this hole, and there was about 3 feet of water standing on the other side that hadn't crested this weir yet, this overflow. And so we poked the cup out of the hole, and it drained like it was supposed to. Went back and looked at the front end, and all of a sudden, all the area that was holding water and was getting rust damage in these metal underground systems. Now it was dry, all because there was a blocked component due to infrequent maintenance. Pore pavement, you can get clogging of pores, loss of the paver fill aggregate, deterioration of the pore surface, and then paint or oil spills and stains. Next slide. Wet ponds, we talked about. You can get an accumulation of silt, which reduces capacity. You can get overgrown vegetation. We talked about cattails. Same thing, broken, damaged outlet structures, leaks we talked about. Rain gardens or biodetention basins, you can get invasion of non-native plants in the basin. You get too few or too many native plants in the basin, or you have dead plant material in there. Too many native plants is an interesting concept. Common goldenrod is one that likes to really get aggressive and take over in some of these basins. And so a lot of times during maintenance, even during the growing season, we'll take out a third of the common goldenrod that's in some of these larger basins because it gets legs. It shades out the others that are supposed to be there. And before you know it, you'd have a monoculture of just the one plant instead of some nice biodiversity there and some nice layered look to it. Again, some of these things can be very, very attractive looking when you have different native plants that grow at different heights, and you can kind of stack them, to where when you're looking at the basin from front to back, you've got different layers and you can kind of see throughout the entire thing. Rain garden maintenance failures, you get erosion along the basin walls, you get accumulation of silt on top of the basin, movement of the mulch or the filter media layer. Okay, so let's get into the last little bit here about cost. We're going to talk about maintaining BMPs, and we're going to talk about the costs associated with them. When does maintenance become a repair or renovation? And then we'll look at the actual maintenance. We'll fly through some photos here of the maintenance being performed on some of these systems. Okay, underground is very specialized maintenance. The cost typically varies for each BMP and the maintenance type. We'll go into some details on those. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to say next slide. So this one should say cost, underground, and specialized maintenance. And then we'll go to the next slide, which should have a couple of photos of some underground systems. On the left is some detention where there is some silt accumulation, and on the right is a specialized upflow filter that has bags in it that the water kind of flows up from the bottom through the bags and into the outlet structure that way. So maintenance needs on the left is obviously the removal of that silt. and debris. Some of it can be done by hand if there's large accumulations, or if there's standing water. Some of it, you need to look at like a vacuum truck or something like that. And then, that's going to obviously change your cost point there. On the right, those filter bags, the company that made the filter will sell you the bags. And so it's just a matter of buying the bags, going and replacing them. They're $100 a bag or $100 a set or something like that for the most part. And typically those have 2 bags in each of those containers. So there you're looking at a six bag system. But those bags will last you quite a while, and you can weigh them. You can bring them out and weigh them during inspections or maintenance activities to kind of see their, if they've accumulated enough material that they need to be replaced. So it's not an everyday or every year occurrence. Next slide. This is an HDS unit. Again, those floatables kind of float to the top. So just a pretty easy routine maintenance that can be done during inspections or, 3-4 times a year is taking a pool skimmer and just picking up the trash, because this is styrofoam and plastic, and it looks like maybe a aluminum beer bottle in there that otherwise would have ended up in a river, lake, or stream. Now it's being collected and confined to a single point. We can collect it, we can put it in a trash bag and put it in the appropriate disposal. Next slide. So on the HDS units, after you get the stuff off the top, then we've got that silt that settles down in the bottom. This is where the vac truck comes in handy. So you stick the vacuum hose all the way down the center of that donut, down to the bottom of the vault. You start removing all the water that's in the vault, and then all the silt that's been collected down in there as well. Each manufacturer will have a recommendation on at what point to perform this maintenance. If the site's well stabilized, we see these go for years without needing maintenance. It's a good thing to check right after construction or right after installation, or after construction is completed, because if any construction silt got into the system, even if it's through the street gutters or something like that, or the curb inlets, then it's collecting down here, and you might be starting day one of an HDS that's already in need of maintenance. So good to follow your manufacturer's recommendations there. These typically range between, depending on how many I can stack in a day, between 1,500 to 2,700 per maintenance visit, and we're getting a couple of years typically between maintenance visits for cleaning these things out completely. Next slide is just the truck that we use. Next slide is a picture of those HDS units after they've been vacuumed out and rinsed out one last time. Next slide. So that was underground. Again, a lot of that specialized cost, a lot of that is going to vary on what it is that you're doing. If you're doing stuff by hand, then you've just got your basic labor costs in there. If you are utilizing that vacuum truck, then we try and stack multiple HDS units on a day to where we can get to 2, 3. I've even done 4 in a day. They were smaller units and they were all close together. We did have to dump the truck a couple of times, but we were able to get 4 in a day, and share that cost of the truck for the day across 4 different units, which brought the individual price and the unit price down. On porous pavement, MSD's recommendations are 3 to 6% of the construction costs of the BMP should be utilized for or estimated for annual maintenance costs. And that's been pretty general of what we've seen on maintenance for porous pavement. Next slide. This is the maintenance needs for porous pavement. You can see kind of in the center there, there's kind of a dusty area That's just an accumulation of grit and debris. Next slide is a close-up of that. So you can see that there's a bunch of smaller material in there that is getting in the way of the pores, not allowing water to work its way through. Next slide, these start to fly pretty good here. So we vacuum up the material that's been collected there. This is a billy goat vacuum. It's a yard vacuum used to pick up like leaves and debris in a yard. If you push it forward like a lawnmower, we lift up the back end to where the nozzle's flat on the ground and we pull it backwards. We all have stronger backs by the end of the summer for it. Looking good in those swim trunks. I can tell you from experience that this is a heck of a workout. And yeah, so we're just trying to capture that debris, pull that debris out of those pores and out of those crevices between those porous pavers that is on the left-hand side of those photos. Next slide is some additional porous vacuum maintenance. This is a sidewalk area. If you notice the photo on the right, there had been some sandblasting nearby, and the right-hand side of that, underneath that manhole lid, is after one pass of the porous, or of the vacuuming on the porous surface. The left-hand side of that same photo is the material that was there. So that's what that entire site looked like before we hit it with the vacuum. So we can see that we are actually pulling up some of that smaller material, clearing those pores and allowing water then to infiltrate through. Next slide. Again, just a lot of this is moving some of that spalled debris, spalled material, the loose aggregate. This is an older piece of porous that wasn't very well constructed, and you get a lot of these loose debris, and so it's a lot of brooming it off, trying to get to a layer that is solid and a layer that is going to work. And this site is actually, that's being replaced, that part of the parking lot's being taken out. They're downsizing the location, and that's going back into vegetation. So they're actually losing that component on a reconstruction of the site. Next slide, we'll talk about maintenance on retention ponds. Before we get to that, again, that 3 to 6% of construction costs, and that's not of the entire site. That's just of like the construction of the components for the porous. That is a good estimate, and that's what we typically see. Specialized maintenance is needed in retention and wet ponds, and again, cost kind of varies by maintenance type. Go to the next slide. So this is the end of the season after herbicide application, where we're cutting and removing the cattail material so that it doesn't fall into the pond, decompose, and then cause further issues down the way. Cattails breed cattails really well, and so the best maintenance on wet ponds is eliminating those cattails. I don't know if I had anything else on that. It's again, if we go back to wet ponds, when you get into the realm of them being silted in, or if you get into forebays being silted in, which again, that's what they're made to do. That's where you have to bring in. You have to dewater the pond. You have to excavate the whole thing out. We did a pond up in North County that did not have any forebays. We ended up taking, I want to say it was 56 dump truck loads of silt and muck out of the bottom of this thing. We spent 4 days dewatering it. This was back in early 2016. I think it was about a $30,000 project for the HOA. By the time we had the machines in there, we had 2 machines running. One was bringing that slop material, skimming and kind of reshaping the bottom of the pond. He was doing that while the other machine was loading the trucks. So two great big excavators, sunk out in the middle of the pond. And again, kind of a specialized deal. That's probably a single, like, once in a lifetime kind of deals for that BMP. We did it once. It's been great ever since, and it'll be years and years and years down the road before it's needed again. But again, this is something that should be factored in on the ownership of these things, that eventually these filters are going to clog, because that's what filters do, and we need to change them. So next slide. We'll cover rain garden maintenance, seasonal maintenance that includes invasive species removal, bringing the mulch, checking the mulch layer, making sure that you've got enough mulch. Pea gravel's good about not running away, not so much with the wood chips. But then there's a winter cut down typically associated each year, where you want to remove that dormant plant material to give room for that new spring growth. And that way you're taking it out of the basin so that it's not sitting on the basin floor, decomposing and potentially clogging the basin. MSD estimates another 3 to 6% of construction costs. And again, that's BMP construction costs. So if, the rain garden costs you $100 to install, then you want to plan on spending 3 to 6% of that every year in annual maintenance. I will say that we have seen newer basins that typically your maintenance costs, your routine maintenance cost, is a little higher the first few years until some of those native plants really get established and really start holding their own against the invasives. You just don't want to, when the new native plants are young, you don't want to allow the weeds and the invasive plants to take over, and because they'll crowd them out. And so then you're looking at a replant, and it's more of a repair down the line. But that 3 to 6% of construction costs is typically a pretty good idea. Next slide. That's our picture of our butterflies again. So we'll go to the next one. Again, this is just pictures of a couple of invasives that we've taken out of basins. You get the little saplings blown in, especially down along the 44 corridor around the Merrimack River. Next slide after that, we've got some thistle, we've got some honeysuckle, just some other invasive plants that just, we'll see them blow into basins or get carried into basins. And so this is what you're looking to take out of there, because that's not what's needed. Next slide after that, Johnson grass, that requires some specialized herbicide application, typically during the summer. And you want to get to that before the seed heads get on. And again, that's kind of a little bit of specialized maintenance there. On the right, you can see some dormant plant material that needs to be cut back there that spring. So that's kind of what we're looking for, to get that cleaned up in the springtime. Go to the next slide. Here's a picture on the left of a winter cut down, just removing that dormant plant material, getting it out of the way. On the right is just pulling weeds. Next slide after that. So is this a maintenance need or a repair within a rain garden? This is a fun site that we had it was really nice rain gardens. And owner called us out to take a look. We complimented them on the rain gardens. Everything looked great. He called us out because MSD had gone by to do a routine inspection and just wanted to know who was maintaining the things. Said, you could probably use to trim back some of the natives a little bit. And, it was a nice full rain garden. There was actually 2 of them on either side of a creek there. And so he mentioned it to the landscaping company and said, hey, can you get in there and trim that back a little bit? Just kind of clean up the edges. And they took weed eaters to it 2 days after the 4th of July. And it has taken 3 years to try to get this basin back into good shape. A couple of different replantings. We had some herbicide application that happened after one of our plantings. Everything was looking good in the spring. And then we came back a couple of weeks later to do one of our first spring maintenance visits, and everything was wilted and dead. And it turned out that we had a landscaping company that thought they were all weeds and sprayed out the basin with Roundup. So that's some of the challenges there, is making sure you got good communication on site. Let's see, next slide. This is about it, I think, on cost for maintenance. I've got a few slides left. We're going to run through some pictures of basins, or I'm sorry, on repairs. Paul, how are we doing on time?
I'd say you've probably used your time up if you can finish it up quick.
Okay. So yeah, we'll save some of the repair pictures. Let's just go ahead and click through these last few just to show off some pictures. I won't do much talking here. So we'll go to the next. That was our rain garden repair there, how it looked, and then kind of mid. So we go to the next one there. This is a continuing repair of that basin. We found good soil underneath it, so we were able just to redo the top layer, and it works great. Next slide after that is the plants being planted, and then a couple of years worth of growth. So pretty good repair there. Again, that was all due to lack of maintenance. Go to the next slide there. We've got a basin that's holding water at a truck stop. Next slide after that is what we found was a bunch of clay in the bottom of this basin. So I don't know if the construction materials were bad or if it got silted in during construction, but you can see on the right-hand side that there's pretty good smear of gray in that excavation. So that's certainly not what we were looking for. Next slide after that is we dug it out to the sand layer, put in a new filter media of that biosoil. Next slide after that, new mulch layer on top. We were able to salvage a bunch of the plants, put some new ones in, and that site there is really looking good. And the basin's not holding water anymore. So MSD is no longer concerned about that one. They had raised a couple of questions. Next slide. This is some routine maintenance on an underground system. That is, if we go to the next slide, after the blue shovel, we took that much material that's on the back of the trailer. We took that much material out of that manhole. And if we go to the next slide, you can see what the manhole actually is supposed to look like. The dark spot there is where that hump of dirt was, and it was completely covering and clogging the entrance into the hydrodynamic separator. And so we found that through inspections that the hydrodynamic separator was not adding any material to it. There was no change over a year. We found this manhole upstream that was clogged. So got that fixed and on the way. Next slide. Here's some of those perlite filters we looked at earlier, just a close up. This is one that's used. Next slide shows maintenance of that. So we vacuum them out and then pull them out of the hole. We vacuumed the stuff out because we had a vacuum truck there already, and it was those are pretty heavy, so it was easier just to vacuum out the material that's inside. Next slide after that, he's rinsing everything out. We took all those canisters out, and then they gave us we bought new ones to put in. And so the next slide after that is a comparison of a new perlite canister versus the old. You can just see kind of what it collects. And that's it on my piece. So again, sorry for the IT confusion. Hopefully this is going out well on the live feed. And that's my contact information there. If there's any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call, check out the website. And the remaining couple of slides after that are just some photo credits. So any photos that I didn't take, Some of the ones at the very, very beginning, I've got some photo credits there because I like to give credit where credit's due, but most of the pictures are ones that we took on site. So with that, Paul, I'll step out of the way. And again, sorry for the IT flub there with Teams, and hopefully this solution worked out all right for us.
Very good. Natural communities cycle resources and hold them in place. Life on Earth really depends on continuous cycling of about 30 to 40 of the 90 chemical elements that occur in nature. And most of the ecosystem services we get are from those plants and the associated soil, community, and root systems. Next slide. Some of the ecosystem services of native plant communities are building soil productivity, capturing and retaining rainfall, and holding deep soil moisture for when we hit the dry weather in summers. It gives habitat and food sources to wildlife and pollinators, and captures and sequesters atmospheric carbon, moderating climate swings and providing us with some natural pest control. Next slide, please. With all the impacts that we're seeing on the land now, the big focus in the last decade has been on sustainable development. Most of these impacts are caused by humans. That's why I put the little cartoon up with the earth saying, "You got humans." But for the benefit of future generations, we really need to make wise use of our remaining resources and find ways to rebuild the natural plant communities and soil communities that provide us with ecosystem services. And with that, my next slide was to kick on the video. Is there any way you can get that to play?
These pictures are worth much more than 1,000 words. But as breathtaking as it is, Missouri's native prairie gives us so much more.
This is an ecosystem that literally created one of the most important underpinnings of the world economy today, the feeding of the modern world.
From a global perspective, there are prairies all across Eurasia and in North America, but they differ very much in character. Wherever they are, though, these prairies have tended to be cut up and plowed and cultivated. They didn't realize the biological richness and integrity of this community.
Prairies harbor a remarkable diversity, the botanical diversity that is found in prairies, and then the diversity of higher level organisms, the fauna.
All of those things are out there doing something. They live in these complex interactions of feeding and decomposing.
When I look at land, it isn't just property. It's a living organism. This water, the soil, and everything that supports each other.
Like so many things in life, we're really beginning to realize the benefit of the prairies now that they're nearly all gone.
Prairie is an original American landscape. More than 1/3 of Missouri was once covered in tall grass prairie, interspersed with savannas and woodlands. Today, that original 15 million acres of prairie has been reduced to fewer than 90,000 acres.
And they're disappearing very rapidly, and that really changes the whole natural balance of the whole northern hemisphere.
We feel it's so important to gain an understanding of this threatened ecosystem before the last of it's gone.
It's not just the grassland itself. It's the canary in our world that says there's things out of balance and we need to put them back into balance.
Native prairie offers bountiful ecological, wildlife, and economic benefits that can actually improve our quality of life.
Prairie gives us so many what we like to call ecosystem or ecological services.
Prairies support at least half of the state's pollinator diversity. And without that, the reproduction of plants and what that means to all the animals that depend on them, that would be broken.
The water storage, the water filtration, the soil erosion prevention.
You know, these grasslands have the ability to absorb up to an 8-inch rainfall.
native plants can help create some of these stormwater management systems that contain stormwater and alleviate pressures downstream. So it alleviates flooding and alleviates erosion.
Those are all things that we've come to learn and appreciate above and beyond the beauty and the biodiversity and the wildlife.
The simple truth is that many environmental problems would be greatly reduced by returning abused land to its native condition.
The amount of fertilizers that are going into our streams, much of that could actually be prevented by having strips or large areas that are surrounded by prairies. We're trying to come up with a way to generate revenue that really uses grassland and provides the ecological services that grassland provide.
But realizing the benefits requires conserving what little original prairie remains, while also restoring more land with native plants from our prairies, savannas, woodlands, and other natural communities.
Missouri Prairie Foundation was a grassroots organization founded in 1966, with the main driver being saving the remnant pieces of prairie that are still left in Missouri.
We've lost the vast majority of native prairie, but because we recognize this loss, now there's this rebound effect that we're trying to preserve the remnants that we can find and afford, as well as establish or reconstruct prairies where we can, where it's appropriate.
There is a real movement now toward the use of native plants and requirements on projects like LEED or Sustainable Sites projects where they're actually requiring the use of native plants.
The Missouri Prairie Foundation protects remaining prairie and restores native grassland communities because prairie can provide irreplaceable benefits for future generations.
The Missouri Prairie Foundation owns and manages prairie. It owns 16 different tracts of prairie totaling more than 2,600 acres. But we've done a lot more than that. We've advocated for the purchase and protection of prairie by state agencies. We advocate for wildlife-friendly policies, agricultural and energy policies.
The Missouri Prairie Foundation is the only organization that's solely devoted to preserving these prairie fragments in Missouri. They will be kept for all time. They're being enlarged as the Prairie Foundation finds the means to do so.
These can't be set aside as though they're in a museum. They're living organisms, and in order for them to have a greater likelihood of adapting to future climatic conditions, it's important that we preserve the greatest number of individuals for these species, as many populations as we possibly can.
I want people to understand what we have and what we're about to lose.
We're not only preserving the grasslands, we're preserving our own existence within this planet.
If we don't work really hard now, we're going to lose even more prairie. This is our opportunity to save prairie for future generations. There are many different ways that individuals can donate funds. We also have volunteer work days where people can have fun and learn about the prairie.
The Missouri Prairie Foundation is a cost-effective, slimmed-down, outstanding organization that can get the job done and keep it in fine shape, develop it, and improve it for the future.
The Missouri Prairie Foundation invites you to explore our prairies and learn more about the benefits of native plants. We also welcome you to join us in our mission to save and restore precious prairie resources for your children and grandchildren. To learn more about the Missouri Prairie Foundation and how your financial support can help protect prairies, visit moprairie.org or call 888-843-6739.
Alrighty, well, soil is a dynamic community of microfauna, decomposing organic matter, and that you can see on that slide on the far left is turf grass with a very, very short root system, and that's why it really doesn't do too much for us in the way of ecosystem services, and has a coefficient of runoff about like asphalt. One interesting thing to note on that is the shorter you mow grass, the more it contracts that root system and impacts the amount of runoff that you get from your soils. And it also requires a lot more inputs to maintain. Next slide, please. You can see from this slide, there was some poor grad students at K-State that dug up a bunch of prairie plants from the Konza Prairie, and they're on display at the center there at Manhattan, Kansas. But it's a live demonstration of what those root systems actually are, and they do some pretty amazing things. Next slide, please. Should be the one with tall grass prairie facts. Most of our land-grant universities have been studying the benefits of native prairie, and looking at that, native tallgrass prairie now is the most endangered ecosystem on Earth, mainly due to the fact that it's the foundation of our modern agricultural system, building all the soils that we now take advantage of to feed the world. But 1 acre of prairie can produce 24,000 pounds of roots, of which about a third senesce every year, and that becomes organic matter digested into the soil. So prairie is the builder of topsoil. Another interesting thing they noted was that in an experiment with northern Iowa, they found that an acre of prairie could actually take up to 9 inches of rainfall before runoff occurred. And the University of Nebraska, just in the matter of just capturing water, found that 14,000 gallons of water could be captured from a 1-inch rain by an acre of prairie restoration. Next slide, please. One of the things the USDA and NRCS has been looking at is carbon sequestration and the benefits of that. But in native soils, it contains between 30 and 60 tons of soil organic carbon in the top 6 feet of soil. But 50% of that is in that top 8 inches of undisturbed soils. USDA put $42 million into the Palouse program, studying how using cover crops, using buffer strips with native plant material, and adaptive paddock management as far as grazing concerns could work towards sequestering carbon. Next slide, please. Soil organic carbon really fuels the soil food web. And every soil organism really has a job to do within that. But the key takeaways from that are rhizobial bacteria work with legumes to fix atmospheric nitrogen and build fertility into your soil, while the mycorrhizal fungi in your soil actually form a symbiotic relationship with plants and help to uptake phosphorus and moisture. Next slide, please. Now, we do this in the rain garden setting by putting some organic matter into the soil. A lot of times there's compost in these engineered soil mixes, but engineered soil is basically designed to kickstart the process of that living soil community, where the plant roots work in conjunction with the fungi and bacteria, and the exudes from that process form soil aggregates in larger sizes and build pore space. So there's basically transmission of nutrients and moistures from plants and through that soil. Next slide, please. Using these BMPs, we're trying to emulate the wetland function or mesic prairie function in conjunction with those soils to deal with our stormwater, and basically building these BMPs, we've increased the soil water holding capacity as well as its ability to degrade and absorb contaminants. Next slide, please. This is Alberici's headquarters, which is one of our earlier projects, but it had what I like to call a systematic stormwater treatment. And the basic gist of that is that the water would actually flow from the impervious surface through a grassland type matrix, then into a wet retention, then behind the rear of the building was a constructed wetland, which was the final purification before the water leave the site. Next slide, please. Establishing these grasslands and that around the wet retention was quite the chore at Alberici because it was a basic recycled site. It was a brownfield that Alberici bought and constructed their facility on, but it was also the first LEED Platinum certified site in St. Louis area. And all the materials had to be disposed of in a environmentally friendly way. So a lot of it was buried on site. It was a rubbly, nasty site. And the CETA system really looked quite sparse in the first year, but you got to remember with native plants, they're perennial and long lived. So it puts down roots the first year mainly, and second year you'll see some top growth. You'll flip to the next slide that shows it grown in. Do you have that one up now, Paul? Anyway, took about 5 years to grow that one in, but now it's become a fully functional stormwater system, as well as a good habitat and example of a place a fellow really doesn't have to cut a lot of grass. Next slide, please. I hope you're looking at the Pea Ridge mine site, which is a strip of erosion blanket that's running down along Mary's Creek. It was rechannelized as part of this reconstruction and putting up phytoremediation cells. The main problem with that site was the water discharged from the site was too high in selenium and copper to actually be able to legally discharge into the watershed. So St. Mary's Creek was stabilized with a matrix of seeded matrix of native plants, and then live staked through the erosion blanket into to stabilize that above the rock to toe slope. Next slide, please. You can see the live stakes if we're on the correct slide. Like I say, I'm doing this on the telephone and not able to see the screen, so it's problematic. Apologize for this train wreck. But the system there was 3 cells surrounded by prairie grasses and forbs, and the thinking being that it would flow, the water flows from one cell to the next cell to the next cell, and only 2 were required to actually meet discharge requirements. And the cells was narrow enough that you could reach across with a long reach should they have to be dredged out when they reach saturation. They used emergent plants within the water and shoreline plants to uptake the copper and selenium. Next slide, please. The seeded matrix underneath the woody vegetation when we installed that was mainly river oats and Virginia wild rye. And the three-cell system functioned within the 3rd year. And at that point in time, actually won the Grand Award from the American Council of Engineering Companies for a novel approach to remediate mine runoff naturally. This basic system is Alberici. It was a system where we went from a dry filtering type strip to wet retention, where you got better settlement of your suspended solids, and then discharging off a dry system and then to the outflow. But it was where engineering met ecology. It was quite the dog and pony show. Flip to the next slide, please. Ecosystem services. Although on the surface, ecosystem services really appear to be free, but we're paying for those in the long run. We kind of owe it to our grandkids and future generations to put some of these systems back in place where we can, when we're considering ways we can do development sustainably and not impair our waterways. Because in the long run, it's a whole lot cheaper to design it in on the front end than it is to deal with all the stream bank stabilization and impacts that we face later on if we don't pay attention to this on the front end. We also get pollinator and wildlife habitat impacts that add resilience to our climate and to our biosphere. Next slide, please. And this one should be a look at a rework of a turfed bioretention. This is really an easy way to put some of these ecosystem services back in place, because, you know, what does that really get us to sit there and run a lawnmower across a detention basin for 25 to 28 times a year? We really get no good return on that at all, where we can add a diverse palette of plant species within that that only require a winter cut down and some minor stewardship and get the job done, as well as adding some of the benefits. The only trick to this retrofitting existing bioretention, next slide please, should be 3 buckets shown on that slide. Is that if the slide has built up a seed bank of weed seed in there from being utility turf and not having good maintenance practices on that, you're going to have to clean it up a little on the front end. It'll pay dividends to do a good turf management program to it for a year prior to trying to convert during a pre-emergent and a post-emergent herbicide to remove some of the weeds before you try to kill it off in the summer with Roundup. And that's the sequence really. You'd want to start killing it off in August, follow up in October after your winter annuals and that start to germinate, and get all of that cleaned up. And then seeding is the other thing. When you're doing native seed, many of the native seeds actually have a adapted dormancy, and they've done this over the years because they've dealt with squirrely weather like we have in Missouri, and don't germinate until after they've had a bit of oscillating cold, moist temperatures to break dormancy and then germinate. That way they don't germinate in the middle of a drought or germinate in an Indian summer and winter. So it's best to seed those November through March. This then should be followed up, because it's not a seed it and walk away thing. First year will require some stewardship, but we normally will high mow those at about 6 inches to a foot 4 to 5 times during the summer months and during the growing season, and then spot spray any persistent perennial weeds out of those. Next slide, please. By the 3rd year, this slide should show some shrubbery on the corner of that basin with the material growing in. And I just wanted to point out one thing. This is it's about 14 years old, this basin, and back then this was new, and I was nut to planted weeds, and so we had to do something to make it a little more acceptable to the HOA, and we threw in some Cosmos bipinnatus sensation mix, just a showy little annual in there to get a little color for them. I prefer to do stewardship these days as opposed to throwing the color at it, but throwing the color at it worked and got acceptance in the early years. And also the little shrubbery around that was planted along with a border in the front, which I don't have a slide on, of prairie drop seed, just to kind of give it a nice defined border. So we found that when installing these natural systems, you know, if you can make them really look intentional, it helps folks that really don't understand the ecosystem services you're providing to get a better acceptance on that. Next slide, please. Here's a turf conversion to a wildflower meadow / buffer strip, because there's a creek on the far left side of that slide that you can see at the bottom of the hill. This was a well-maintained turf. Didn't have much of a weed seed bank like you would find in fallow ground or something that was like utility turf. It was maintained intensively. So it only required a couple applications of glyphosate to kill off the turf, and then was seeded the following winter. And I learned you can get a little too carried away. Next slide. Big pink field of flowers, I hope. It is that Cosmos bipinnatus. The corporate folks, they just really loved that because it was showy and it was nice. And it did grow up enough to shade out the winter blow-ins and winter annuals. It worked out well. But in a scenario where you use something like this, you would really want to do a prime cleanup first, because that wouldn't look very attractive with 8-foot tall giant ragweed poking up out of the middle of it. Let's flip to the next slide. This was also the early years before we really paid attention to how many seeds per square foot we were putting down, and got carried away and put down 5 pounds of black-eyed Susan to the acre because it was cheap. Still looked pretty good, but like I say, got carried away with the black-eyed Susan, but everything worked out. Flip to the next slide. By the third year, we had all 16 species of wildflowers and 4 species of grasses showing. So we had good species diversity, and it was well accepted. It went in, did its job, and stabilized that hillside, as well as doing a good job of filtration, and got a few attaboys on it. Let's flip to the next slide. There's a close-up of the plant palette in there, and it was attractive. And like I say, most of the native species are still persisted to this day, and that planting's over 20 years old. Next slide. This one should be adding structure and function. Just a little sidebar. I really prefer and think you can add structure and function to these bioretentions. And this is Aberdeen Heights Assisted Living down there in Kirkwood by Merrimack Junior College. And the thinking behind this was by adding the trees and having 3 layers, basically a overstory, a mid-shrubby story in places, and a ground layer, that we could get more increased evapotranspiration. And with our clay soils, a lot of times they don't percolate, but during the summer months you can move a lot of water with plant material being taken up by the plants, and then out the stomata of the plant material and back into the atmosphere. And to accomplish this even better, we did use a lot of sedges and semi-evergreen material, because you'll find the effectiveness of bioretentions is somewhat reduced when you hit winter. You still get the absorption of heavy metals and things, and they're engineered soil and root systems, but you really don't have any of the benefits of green growing plants. So extending that season was the thinking behind that layering effect, and it made it a lot more attractive, and the diversity actually added some resilience to this planting. Flip to the next slide. Should be the plan of that planting. Yeah, for a shrubby layer, we used 9-bark, red twig dogwood, smooth hydrangea, New Jersey tea, and fringe tree for accent. Other basins we used red bud and all other small understory type trees. For the graminoid component, the grasses, we used, in this particular one, switchgrass and soft rush. For perennial wildflowers, we used New England aster, swamp milkweed, obedient plant, shining blue star, copper iris, cardinal flower, and rose turtlehead. And flip to the next slide, please. This is that particular BMP during installation. You also notice we put some boulders in there. Those are actually good perching spots for butterflies and invertebrates. Divots within the top of these boulders actually held a little water, so it's a water source for them, but it's just kind of to add to the aesthetics and have some winter interest when everything's cut back. That really adds something to it as well, but it kind of looks like a traditional landscape. If you flip to the next slide, that should be that planting grown in. It's kind of like the landscape architect's dream, something spiky, something frilly, something round, and a rock. But anyway, this one has persisted for over 10 years. We were pulled off it. Somebody else did the maintenance, and it actually held up and looked well. We just got pulled back into stewardship last year on it. And like I say, I'm really kind of proud that that one's holding up as well as it did. You should go by and take a look at it sometime if you have a chance. Next slide, please. This should be a bioretention in the middle of a parking lot that's about ugly, but this is what not to do. I mean, it has good sedge component, but it really didn't, over the lifespan, maintain its cover. A lot of the species died out, and I think we've learned a lot since the early days of when this one was installed. It wasn't one of ours, and I won't poke fun at who installed it. Next slide, please. This should be a real showy looking bioswale with a lot of red, blue, and yellow flowers. Those are cardinal flower and great blue lobelia, which I want to point out are short-lived, so you should use them sparingly. They move around every 2 to 3 years, and when you run out of bare dirt for the seed to settle into, they kind of go away. But it's a good working and functioning, aesthetically pleasing system. Next slide, please. This is a nice roadway system where the bioswale actually ties into the BMP, gives you 2/3 of the treatment train or systemic stormwater treatment system that you would be looking for. And the only thing really missing is when it hits that pipe, it would flow into some type of wetland system at the bottom before it hits your watershed. You'd have a pretty clean discharge coming out of that as far as uptaking and removing contaminants of concern. Next slide, please. This is Express Scripts. It's right there off of Highway 40 in Brentwood. It's a nice BMP, although out here in St. Charles County, I don't think we've got enough places where you could get that much real estate for your BMP. That always seems to be the limiting factor. This one did a good job, but after installation wasn't maintained, and it's one we need to go market to because it's loaded up with cattails pretty good now. Next slide, please. Here's one that was just a high-end homeowner and really wanted to be able to access the edges of the pond to fish in that. And that was the main point of this one, was it wasn't really such a BMP as a fish factory. You'll see the pickleweed on the edges actually acts much like the buffer strip grasses that you'd put in a normal BMP setting, but provide good habitat for fathead minnows and provides a cycling ecosystem there for a pond system. Next slide, please. This one should be a stone wall with a retention in the middle. This is shortly after construction. And you can see by the turbidity of the water that the surrounding turf needs some attention. And you got me started now on turf. And I'm kind of old school. I think a little bit is enough to do you as far as turf goes, but why do we love lawns so much? I mean, they're good to look at. They're the expected status quo. They're static and they're dependable, and they're pretty simple to maintain, which I think is one of the main drawbacks with native systems. People really have not got to the point that they're familiar with maintaining these native systems and keeping them in that intentional looking state. Turf provides some minuscule ecosystem services as far as urban cooling and a little bit of carbon sequestration, but not very much since they're mowed so close that the root system really doesn't allow for much of an A horizon in your soils. And this is really offset a lot of times just by lawn care contractors or homeowners getting on a romp, and a little's good, so more is better. So they lay on that fertilizer to get it to a St. Patty's Day green and spray it 4 times a year. And that really offsets a lot of the benefits you would get from a native system and turf. Next slide, please. This should be the United States. As a nation, we're pretty obsessed here with our turf grass. There's 40 million acres of turf grass in the U.S. And do we really need all that turf grass? It really doesn't do that much for us, and I think we could find something better to do with our Saturday mornings. And much of that was installed with uncompacted soils, just throwing down the sod, and then a irrigation system, which I like to call an irrigation system, was installed into that to keep it alive. They never seem to work all the time. And then we proceed to throw down between 100 and 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre on that, which really at the end of the day, that just gets you a subdivision pond that's full of filamentous algae. But we fueled a whole industry by these bad behaviors and bad decisions, because there's a lot of folks making a pretty good living out of core aerifying and trying to loosen that soil and trying to keep that little bit of sod alive and striping it up with a lawnmower. It's just a cascading effect, but like I say, it has a negative environmental impact. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I really don't enjoy cutting grass. Next slide, please. There should be says savanna restoration used as a riparian buffer. Really, riparian buffers on our minor waters, creeks and streams going through and draining our subdivisions and our parks and areas could do a lot better job of managing stormwater if they were managed effectively. This is a riparian buffer that was restored about 15 years ago. Still in place today and looking pretty good, but it's a grassy matrix of river oats and Virginia wild rye, and it captures a lot of runoff, as well as it's had some wildflowers added to it since this stage, and benefits the pollinators in that as well. Flip over to the next slide. And this is basically kind of what it looked like before. It was overgrown with 8-foot tall honeysuckle in it. And really the impact of invasive species like bush honeysuckle are that it forms such a dense canopy and so much shade that it completely eliminates the ground level vegetation. So water just sheets under that, taking silt and sediment with it into our waterways. So that's the thinking behind that, is replacing that with something that actually does infiltrate water and catch some sediment would be the low-hanging fruit for a lot of scenarios when planning development. The steps in establishing a buffer strip is, next slide please, this should be a no-till drill on a John Deere tractor in the woods. Is to remove that honeysuckle. And the sequence we used on that one, like I said, was to establish that grassy matrix first, and allowing us the time to come back in while the grass was there and spray a selective herbicide without impacting our grass, be able to take out any honeysuckle resprouts, and then within a year or two, go ahead and seed the wildflowers and forb species into that to get the additional benefits. Next slide, please. This should be alternate mitigation for impervious surface. This is a green roof. It's over at University of Illinois in Edwardsville. This is one that they did that actually was an experiment on energy efficiency. They got enough roof insulation that significantly lowered their energy uses by putting that soil layer on top of their roofing membrane and having it planted. Next slide, please. This one is a seeded green roof. It was not done from strictly plants. It was, the engineered soil was actually blown onto the roof and then graded and covered with a short grass prairie mix, and then covered with erosion control blanket to hold things in place and actually maintain moisture. This is at the Great Rivers Research Center over in Alton. And like I say, another one that stood the test of time. Next slide. That's just another view of the side angle of that one. Next slide. This one should be the green roof on a modular green roof system that's sitting on top of BJC Hospital downtown by Forest Park. A lot of your green roofing has gone to just a mix of sedum, some exotic and some native. They work out well, and you'll find with these green roof systems, they all have a leak detection system underneath your soil layer. But with the modular systems, it's much easier if you do have a problem or do need to make another roof penetration to be able to pull a few of these modules out, do your work, and then they're easily replaced. Next slide, please. This should be a funny looking tree made into a chair with a fellow sitting in it. But be creative, learn to adapt and make daily decisions to protect our ecosystems. It really does pay off to plan that way, and think about your grandkids when you're planning a development or doing this type of work. What type of world do we really want to leave them with? Anyway, I appreciate your time and patience, and hopefully we can do this thing live next time. It goes a whole lot smoother when you can see the slides and we can have a little better coordination. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Can you see that?
Yep, Richard, looks like you're coming up. We got a shared screen.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. You ready to go then?
Yeah, I guess at least the one internal connection worked, and my external guys couldn't connect. All right, Rich was on the screen for being last. He's with our new, talk about our new ordinance. Rich, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and continue with your presentation?
Sure. Thank goodness for small favors, right?
Yeah.
My name is Rich Necco. I'm the division director of the Development Review Division here in the Community Development Department of St. Charles County. I want to thank all of our speakers today. I apologize for the problems we're having. We're somewhat new to Teams and the virtual world, so we'll try and do better next time. But like John said, hopefully we'll be doing this live either later this year or next year for our next one. But again, I think what I've got to say pairs well with what the speakers are bringing across today so far, and how the county established its new stormwater quality ordinances. So in 2018, we had an audit by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, and they found that our stormwater management program was deficient in addressing water quality of long-term stormwater runoff to the maximum extent practicable. The county had a long history of strongly utilizing non-structural BMPs and addressing water quality. In 2002, we were the first community in the state to create a stream preservation and water vegetative buffer protection ordinance. We had a tree preservation ordinance early on too. I don't remember whether that was 03 or 06, but it was very early on. We've been doing stormwater detention since the early 80s. As far as rate control, it's not for extended detention or water quality, but we at least had been addressing some of that flooding issue. So we felt we were in a pretty good place with our non-structural stuff. We had several other non-structural programs. We have on-site sanitary sewer requirements in our areas. So we have a lot of different non-structural programs, and we were heavily reliant on that. Obviously, DNR felt that wasn't enough. Sometimes I'm not sure that when I hear DNR quote their language and I hear them quote the Clean Water Act, when you read that for MCM5, you know, it tells you need to have structural and or non-structural BMPs. And I don't ever hear the and or the or part or the or part in that whole thing. So like I said, we were heavily reliant on non-structural. We realized that we did have a need for structural BMPs. We were behind the other municipalities in the county. We weren't on a level playing field. And we needed to catch up with some things. And it took some convincing of our council and other staff here at the executive level to bring that point across. But rather than fight DNR or the EPA, we wanted to go ahead and create our program for water quality. So in trying to convince our folks here, we told them that over 95% of our storm events didn't go even detained in our stormwater requirements, and they were untreated and discharged directly into ponds, streams, rivers. We don't have combined sewer systems in the county. These don't go to sewer treatment plants. So our goal was to create an ordinance requiring structural best management practices to address water quality and satisfy the MDNR and US EPA requirements. So we started this process. One of the things I requested was for a consultant, and we were denied that and denied funds for something like that. So we did this at a staff level, and this took us probably 2 years to get hold. And some of that was over the time of COVID. So, you know, that threw a wrench into some things on the way. But the first thing we tried to do was establish a stakeholder advisory group. We reached out to members of the local home builders association, local consulting engineering firms, local development community. We reached out to people like John Wingo and Steve Polk, who's the next speaker, because we're concerned about the maintenance and the design of these structural facilities. We reached out to council members and members of city councils that were receiving complaints from the community about water quality and flooding issues and stormwater issues. And then we also have a considerable amount of agricultural stakeholders in the county. And while we're not required to regulate those, we have a close partnership with the University of Missouri Extension and our local soil and water conservation district. And we provide outreach and they provide programs to our agricultural community. And that's how we try to serve that community as well. So those people were also involved in this stakeholder group. And fortunately, the timing was right for this for us, because this isn't always the case. Like I said, we've had council members, we had city council people that were receiving complaints fairly frequently during this time about additional, you know, a lot of it was people in the floodplain seeing more water coming down, seeing dirtier water coming down. We also are to the point now that our parks are starting to form they're wanting to develop our streams and put people in, so they're developing blueways along some of our streams now, along some of our larger creeks and rivers. And so we're now starting to put people in the water and putting them in kayaks and canoes and pulling them out of the water. So, you know, we have an obligation to make sure that we're addressing our water quality needs. So with this stakeholder group, we established goals for what we wanted to accomplish with this. And these are important, and these are basically what I'm going to be bringing forward for you for the rest of this time here. So if you're an engineer out there and you want to see a lot of equations and formulas, that's not going to be a whole big part of this talk. I'm going to be talking more about what we want to see out of this stuff. And again, you know, we're focused heavily on the non-structural stuff. And we feel that if we can provide that as much as possible, we're going to be very limited to what we need as these structural BMPs. And that should help reduce the cost not only of your construction, but the people that you're leaving these with in terms of cost of maintenance and ease of maintenance of their property. So we wanted to encourage and incentivize the use of non-structural BMPs to the maximum extent practicable, and you'll see that in this design criteria. We wanted to be flexible in the design. So yes, we're going to have these design standards and we're going to have design guidelines, but we're going to allow you to use other agencies and other municipality standards. We're also going to be flexible in the use of looking at alternative BMPs to use to address these problems. We want to allow and encourage BMPs that address multiple water quality benefits. So we like the treatment train. We like the ones that can be nested. I understand the need to try and address this at the source, but I'm not sure that that's practical in a lot of development here. Where it can be, that's great, but it can't be in all places. We want these to be economical to construct, and we especially want these to be economical to maintain for the people that we're leaving these with, and ease of maintenance. So we've seen a lot of these planning palettes today and stuff, and that can be cumbersome. So unless you have a professional maintaining these, that's going to be difficult for private property owners. And a big thing too is that these structural BMPs, they need to be an amenity to your development. They need to work with your development. They need to be functional for your development. We don't want these to be a hole in the ground that is holding water for 48 or 36 hours or longer. We don't, or not have plants grow in them or look raggedy. So we don't want these to be a nuisance or an afterthought. We want these to function with the site. We want these to be an amenity to the site. We want these to be a place for people to use and be and attract more development. And then, of course, when these absolutely have to meet MDNR and US EPA's regulatory expectations. So with that, we began a draft of ordinance and design criteria. We got back with our stakeholder group for their review. We finished up our preliminary draft and sent it out to public comment. We had presentations to our floodplain vision board and our planning and zoning commission. We ran our drafts by our Commission on Environmental Quality. So we tried to get as much public comment and involvement as possible with this. We held workshops with our county council. We had to have several meetings with our county council. This didn't go through right away. It took a few meetings. There were some things that got changed throughout, but it worked. In December of 2020, after almost 2 years or over 2 years, we finally got through with our ordinance approval. And we have a draft of the design criteria. It is not online yet. We're still trying to finalize it with some charts and appendices and supplements. So I'm doing my best to get that out online on by June of this year. I do have a draft for anyone that needs it. Feel free to contact our office. We'll give you a draft copy of this ordinance. I am going to, after this presentation, put a draft copy out online where our design criteria currently exists. But this new design criteria will not be revised until at least June of this year. So look for it online at that point. And again, sort of the way we decided to go with this is we looked at a nested approach where we want to provide stormwater treatment for water quality volume, channel protection volume, and we want to provide some flood protection, overbank protection. We also want to have a way in those larger storm events to safely convey that water from the development, from the basin, and safely downstream into our natural water courses. So these are the sections of our ordinance that were revised. These were pretty simple. These didn't contain a lot of detail. In section 405, which we call the Unified Development Ordinance, all of these sections, our site plan ordinance was changed to require stormwater quality BMPs for commercial sites per our design criteria requirements. They were required, private site owners are required to have an agreement for the long-term preservation and maintenance of these BMPs. They are required to put the performance guarantee up for the cost of these BMPs to make sure that they get installed correctly. And we put that in with their sediment and erosion control performance guarantee. We didn't create a separate mechanism for this. We felt it would be simpler to not create new things, allow these to be done with existing measures here. And there's an as-built plan requirement for when the facilities are completed. 410 is where we have our subdivision regulations, and we changed those similarly. We did correct a tree preservation ordinance in there that was referencing the wrong section for replacement of trees, so that's now corrected. But short of that, we haven't changed anything about our tree preservation ordinance. We are requiring again now these stormwater quality BMPs for subdivisions per our design criteria. And actually the when required section was put into 410. And there's again as-built plan requirements for these subdivision facilities. And then we had to also modify section 412, which is our sediment and erosion control ordinance and our land disturbance ordinance. And again, we're allowing the sediment and erosion control performance guarantee. We're allowing the cost for these BMPs to be put up in that performance guarantee rather than requiring multiple performance guarantees and burdening developers with that. Again, those were pretty simple changes. Those were approved in December. The more complex part was the design criteria that we have to create for this. And so we created section 70. Essentially, we pulled section 50.8, which was our stormwater management stuff, our detention, stormwater detention requirements, and we pulled it out of section 50 and we created a whole new section 70. And so this is our post-construction stormwater management requirements. And we'll go through each of these sections here today fairly quickly. But it starts out with purpose, and that's important to us. Again, there's not a lot of formulas in that, but the purpose sets out the whole strategy for how we want you to approach this this design. 7010 is our design criteria that tells you when these types of stormwater management is required. It tells you the standards and the sizing requirement to build these two, and it's got as-built submittal requirements again for those facilities. 7020 gets into your BMP preservation and maintenance. So we need long-term preservation of these BMPs, and we need to assure that they're maintenance. And the county also has an ordinance in section 420, I believe, 420.020, where that spells out the county's inspection program for these facilities for to assure long-term maintenance of them. So section 7030 starts getting into these design guidelines for BMPs. We have non-structural BMPs and credits for such that will help you reduce the amount of structural BMPs you need. Could also eliminate the need for them if you did that properly. And then it gets into our categories of acceptable structural urban BMPs. 740 is currently under construction. We do not have that ready yet. When this design criteria goes out in June, 7040 will not be ready yet. 7040 will probably not be ready until the end of this year, is my guess. We have pulled most of this stuff from the Georgia Stormwater Manual. We felt that Georgia's soils and topography and hydrology were the most similar to our county for the manuals that we were looking at to use. Nothing wrong with the Maryland Stormwater Manual, nothing wrong with MARC Manual, but they didn't seem to fit our needs as well as the Georgia Stormwater Manual did. So that's where most of our stuff is coming from. When we get into 7040, that's where most of those guidelines will be coming from. But again, we're flexible, and you'll see later in this this discussion, you're going to be able to use multiple agencies' BMPs as long as they're meeting those standards that are set up in 7010. So So the design criteria starts out with purpose. And again, this sort of goes down through how we want you to do the design or think about how you're doing the design. And the first thing to us would be, let's preserve what we can. Let's keep the trees. Let's keep the deep-rooted vegetation. Let's use things that mimic nature, like John Wingo was talking about. We can restore prairie area. We can put in deep-rooted vegetation. We can use level spreaders to put runoff into sheet flow and put them back into these filter areas. So wherever we can, let's use these things that help prevent runoff in the first place. And where we can't, let's start to look at runoff reduction methods, things that do remove the water by evaporating the water, or being taken up by plants and transpiring the water, or by holding and reusing the water during times of drought, or holding and reusing the water before the next storm event. So all of those things to us would be better than providing something that's just merely providing filtration and maybe slowing the water down before it gets back into the water. Nothing wrong with those. We're going to accept those, but that's not our preference, and that shouldn't be your, as far as we're concerned, that should be your last priority in design. So after considering all of that, then we can start to get into these structural water quality BMPs, and then we need to look at the protection of our channels, and our stream impairment and our erosion. And quite frankly, that's our biggest problem in the county. You know, we've been able to avoid, since we've been proactive with these non-structural things, we've been able to avoid a lot of problems that we've seen in St. Louis County and other places that developed earlier than St. Charles County. So we've been able to learn a lot from that. We've been able to avoid a lot of that, but we still have the same problems with our urban erosion and our streams and things like that. So those are more of our issues than I would say pollution or water quality. But we see the need for all of that. Again, we have been addressing stormwater detention, like I said, since the early 80s or mid 80s. So we've got a pretty good handle on that overbank and flood protection, but that remains a part of what we're doing here. And again, the purpose of these things too should be cost and ease to construct and maintain. We're not looking to build large structural things. We would like to try and avoid that if at all possible. And I know some developments can't do that, but the type of development we see in St. Charles County typically can. We don't have a lot of large commercial development or industrial development. And we're just starting to get back into some higher density urban residential development now, but those typically haven't been our problems in the last 10 or 20 years here. We want these things to function with the site. We want them to function for recreation. We want them to be an amenity to the site. They should have functionality to the site, and I'll show you some examples of that in slides later on, where they've used the BMPs to help promote the use of their site. These things should enhance property values and quality of life. They shouldn't be an afterthought. They shouldn't be a nuisance. And then, of course, they should achieve regulatory compliance. So our water quality standards, and for new development, this is new to us, where we have land disturbance greater than or equal to 1 acre, you now have this water quality component to address. Subdivision developments that have minimum 3 acre lot sizes are exempt from this requirement. This was a discussion we had to have with council. We could not convince some of the council members to vote for this without exempting the lower density residential subdivision development. And I get it, and that development for the most part does follow more open drainage plans. It has less problems with concentrated runoffs, storm sewers, impervious areas. Most of those are disconnected, but we don't always have those types of development. So, so the caveat is where it fits that mold, we didn't have a whole lot of problems with that. So that was something that the council felt was necessary, and those types of developments are exempted from our ordinance. So again, the strategy on water quality, and we got 3 types. Number 1, let's try and identify and protect environmentally sensitive areas to the maximum extent practicable. So these can be used later as credits later too, as you'll see later on in our presentation. And those will help reduce the overall structural water quality volume requirements that you need here. But the first thing that we want you to do is let's identify areas that are environmentally sensitive or areas that we can protect or have to protect under our ordinance, and utilize that BMP. The second thing is what can we do to prevent runoff reduction? Let's use BMPs that can evapotranspirate. Let's use rainwater harvesting. Let's hold water and reuse it again. A lot of this new technology, and again, back in '72 when the Clean Water Act came up, their anticipation, and again, even in the '80s, their anticipation for these phase 2 MS4s is that there's going to be cost-effective technology that comes along that's going to solve a lot of these problems, and it's starting to get here, I believe now. We have systems where it can be computerized and use gates, and all kinds of different technologies now that can be used. And so the last thing we want you to be looking at in our area is infiltration. I know we've seen a lot of examples of that today, but again, I don't quite understand why we want to be, and again, we've been doing this for a while too, and probably over 70% of our structural BMPs are infiltration BMPs. I just don't understand why we want to have to change the soils all around to create something that we don't have that's going to go back into a clay layer. We're really, and we're putting, to make it work here in our soils, we're putting in a lot of under drainage systems and stuff. So you basically just have a fancy filtration system at best in that sense. I don't understand that so much. And the use of the Maryland system where they have those sandy soils or those soils that will infiltrate, I don't see that as being as effective in this area. We're not going to tell you can't use them, but we strongly encourage the other ones rather than this. Again, and then anything that's not left to those first two, the protection and the non-structural, the prevention of the runoff and the runoff reduction structural BMPs, then we have to incorporate these water quality facilities to take care of the rest of our water quality volume. On redevelopments, a little bit different. While we still have that same requirement to kick in the water quality at the 1 acre, we're going to be a little bit. We're going to work with these redevelopments a little bit because we know that the site constraints may not be able to address a lot of this stuff, and we're cognizant of that. So we're not asking them to build new water quality facilities per se. And we'll get into a couple slides where I'll show you what our strategy would be. One of our councilmen during all of this discussion kept continually showing this slide in another municipality and in his area of representation, where there was a commercial development that was required to put in a rain garden. The rain garden was terribly constructed. It held water. It didn't have any viable plants in it. It looked like one of those what not to do slides that John and Drew were showing earlier today. And it didn't work with the, nothing worked with that other than you needed that, plunk it in there, we're done. And that's not what we're looking for here. So for example, here's a site in St. Charles County. This is the outer road for Highway 70. Highway 70 is up here. This site went out of business. I believe it was a furniture wholesaler at one point in time in this metal building. But you can see on this site at the time that it was up for sale, it had a lot of paved surface. The surface back in here was rock for the most part, but compacted rock. They had a lot of storage back there. This was a wooded area. Right here is, and it goes under the highway, is Sanford Creek in St. Charles County. It is a regulatory floodplain. It is a large creek. It ends up discharging into the Missouri River. Actually, that one goes to the Mississippi, I'm sorry. Eventually, But you can see the retaining wall was failing. It was a wooden retaining wall. The buffer area was full of garbage and debris. The retaining walls right up on top of the banks over here. So when a gentleman came in to purchase the site, and their idea was to redevelop the site, and they sell basically equipment for agriculture, small time, nursery operations. They're selling tractors, they're selling lawnmowers, they're selling, disking equipment, all that kind of stuff. So what we asked them to do, rather than put that hole in the ground somewhere out here, was we worked with the gentleman and we said, what else can you do on this site to make up for that water quality? And so we worked things out with them. So if you'll notice, all of this impervious area back here has been removed. So now you got nice green area over here. They defined their parking area better. They did put up a new building right here, but they put in rain barrels for these roofs. So they were catching and storing that water and using that water to irrigate this new area over here. They pulled the retaining wall back and built a modular wall. So they provided more buffer that was required along Sanford Creek. Rather than add storm sewer to their new pavement over here, they disconnected it and they allowed this water to sheet flow off, and they spread it out right here and allowed it to drain all the way this way down before it got into Sanford Creek, instead of being discharged directly the way it was prior. In addition to that, they wanted to display their equipment up here, which makes great sense. They got visibility to Highway 70 and the outer road to Highway 70. And they built a retaining wall here, and they leveled this section out, and they wanted to build a lot here to put their display area. We convinced them to keep that in vegetation. I believe they used a paving system underneath that, a geogrid system that allowed grass to grow up through there. And so now we've got all that absorbs water as too. So like I said, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. We don't need you to be just dumping rain gardens or infiltration facilities in your development. We need things that work for your development. In this case, this helped him display his equipment. It looked way better than a concrete pad because his equipment's on all this nice green stuff, like it's made to use. So that's the sort of thing we're looking for in these types of developments. Hold on 1 second. All right, another example, this is a development in St. Charles County where some additional parking was added to this facility, and this area up here is the additional parking area. This facility did not have any stormwater management for the most part on it at all. You can see in this picture the amount of impervious surface that's involved in this. And then back here we have the natural water course that's running through this apartment complex. So what these people did is they put a curb on the end of their parking area, and they allowed this new parking area to drain into this sand filter. And rather just have a sand filter that's taking up a bunch of space, this facility sells a lot of lawn ornament equipment, landscaping stuff. It's a large landscaping retailer. And so what they did, and they didn't just waste the use of this space. These products, like here's a rock, it's basically just a piece of plastic, but it's something you can use in your own landscape that looks like a rock. So they're showing all these products that they're selling in combination with the sand filter in itself. And right here you can see the outlet for the sand filter that ends up draining down this cobble through the parking area and ends up going down into that water course. So this new area that they built up here, we didn't try to go back and get everything done for what was already done a long time before that, but any new development up here, we did get them to address that with this sand filter in a manner that works with their site. So that's what we're looking for in these designs. Stormwater detention. In residential subdivisions, again, with greater than 3 acre lots, this is exempt. But our new requirements for stormwater detention is that we look at the differential runoff during a 15-year, 20-minute design storm event. This really hasn't changed for us. However, we do have a couple new components to detention. However, the differential runoff we're looking at now, and I should add that the county previously had a rule that when you were in that differential runoff of between 2 and 5 CFS, it was required at 2, and between 2 and 5, the director could waive that requirement. We got rid of that component, so now it's being required for subdivisions at 2 CFS. In non-residential commercial developments and in redevelopments, that is now being required at 3.5 CFS. Because kind of what we had been doing throughout this time is trading that detention when you were in that 2 to 5 range, generally up to 3.5. Sometimes I approve more than that, but that was sort of the limit for us. We would trade off that water quality for stormwater detention. So, so this is how we decide to do it. We don't have that waiver anymore, but we did raise the requirement because we feel that if we're getting that water quality volume and that water quality cleanup, and we're addressing that first flush of runoff, we don't necessarily need that standard detention for those smaller storm events anymore. There's some miscellaneous exemptions in this, such as if you're draining into a lake or a large body of water that doesn't have any erosion problems, that you may not need these detention standards. But I'm not going to go through all of that. Those are in the design requirements. There's also a caveat where if we have downstream impairments or downstream problems, these things can be required regardless of the runoff differential. As I said, in redevelopment, sort of the same thing. So we've got two different situations. We're sites where we have developed sites that weren't required to have stormwater detention previously. We need to go back to the site before its development. And since that's difficult to do, we're going to go back to 2012. Typically, when I've waived stormwater detention for these types of sites, it's been because they've been developed for 10, 20 years. We're looking at 2 or 3 generations, maybe, for a downstream water course to be able to change itself due to the upstream development. So the thought is if that development has existed long enough, that the water course downstream's probably had a chance to modify itself to handle this additional runoff, and we probably don't need to go back and treat it. There's nothing magic about the year 2012. We have good aerial photography from that year. We don't have any good aerial photography we can use prior to 2012, where we can measure impervious surface as well. So that's why we picked that year. Moving forward, that's probably going to need to be updated at some point. But we're going to go back and look at these sites without prior stormwater detention to see what they look like in 2012. And we're going to measure the new impervious surface since that point. And once you get to that 3.5 CFS differential, you're going to need to have stormwater detention. On developed sites that already were required to have stormwater detention and do, the only channel and flood protection you'll have to provide is for any increase in the runoff. So we're not going to ask you to go back and update it for what was there previously. So you need to address any increase in the runoff, and the difference is going to be this extended detention, because you would have had the requirement for the 10-year flood protection detention previously. If you're going to use existing facilities to provide this detention, then you need to retrofit those facilities to meet our new stormwater management requirements. And again, we're cognizant that redevelopments may have a tough time meeting this requirement. We're willing to work with these developments. We're willing to look at alternatives to providing these sorts of things. Again, just like the other new development, we have some miscellaneous exemptions where these don't have to be provided, and the county can step in and require them where we know we have downstream problems. And so this is kind of the new stuff in here from people not familiar with what St. Charles County does, I'm not going to go back and tell you what our old standards were, but this is kind of new. These have changed in the new design criteria. Our rainfall data is now going to be taken from NOAA Atlas 14. There's a link to that site right there, and it's going to be specific to the site. So what's cool about this is you can go to this map, you can go into St. Charles County, you can click exactly where your site is in St. Charles County, and it will generate a tabular table for you that shows you all of these design precipitation amounts for the 1-year event, the 15-year event, the 10-year event, the 2-year event, the 100-year event, and so on. So this is where you're going to get your precipitation data from. The HBA had a little bit of a problem with this when we were discussing this, but I convinced them that when you look at the weather stations that they're taking this data from around the county and within the county, there's a considerable difference between where you are in the county on the precipitation you're using. So we didn't want to just give you one standard. We wanted it to be site specific, and that way not everyone's going to be burdened by over designing these in certain places. Another change we had is that we do now have a maximum for the sheet flow length that you can use for time of concentration and your post-construction. If you're in a developed area, that overland sheet flow maximum is now 100 feet. Again, we want to be looking at site-specific stuff. I know there's not one thing that fits all, so we're willing to be flexible. And we'll get into that discussion a little bit later here too, but all of these things can be talked about with our staff. We are now imposing a maximum curve number value where pre-developed conditions cannot be determined. This is typically in areas where we have agricultural development. We do not consider agricultural development to be the pre-developed condition. It's sometime there was something there before that agricultural development. So typically, in those situations where we can't determine what the site was, we're going to tell you go back to meadow and use those curve numbers for meadow, depending on your hydrologic soil condition. And again, if you're in the rational method, we're going to use 5% impervious. We also have a exemption in there. There is a way, if you have drainage areas of less than 5 acres to your detention facilities, you can get approval from me to use the 15-year 20-minute hydrograph, which we have an old little 15-year 20-minute trapezoidal hydrograph that we've used. Typically, we're allowing that for 10-acre drainage areas, but we've reduced that down to 5. A lot of that information comes out of the Georgia Stormwater, or that direction comes out of the Georgia Stormwater Manual. But again, typically we don't want to get into that. One of the things I think long-term we need to look at is a better hydrograph. One more, I don't think we need to be using the TR55 24-hour one like we are now with the type 2 rainfall distribution. And I think even NRCS is looking at that and looking to modify that. But right now, that's what we're using. Looking down the road, we may be looking into some other hydrographs to use that are more suitable to what occurs in our county. Another thing that we have done is we have eliminated the use of concrete swales in all of our basins. We have not been allowing that for a long time, even though our design criteria requires that. So we want to use some sort of permeable swale. Forebays may need to be incorporated in these depending on the design that you're using. So, that may be a component of it. Riprap swales are also allowable for use. The permeable swale designs we have are with or without under drainage. If we strongly recommend the use of under drainage, again, our soils are not going to soak water into the ground or into these clay soils. So unless you're unusually lucky and you hit a pocket of sand, or you're in a hydrologic soils group A or B soil that you're not compacting, you're probably going to need to modify the soils for the use of these permeable swales. And again, we strongly prefer the under drainage system. I know that adds a component of cost, but what we've seen what we've seen for cost of these permeable swales, even with under drainage, is far less than what the cost of the concrete swales have been. And again, I love the idea of native plantings. When we do inspections on these existing basins, we throw out that alternative to people. I love John Wingo's pictures of these basins that have been converted from turf to natives with the concrete swale in the middle. I love that. And again, we're not allowing people to replace the concrete swales when they go. So these native plantings are a great idea. And I hope that we see more of that. We're starting to see some of that now. Again, the idea of the permeable swale is that if you're going to put the turf grass in these basins, it's got to be able to drain. I can't have basins that hold water for long periods of time and that get torn up when you get a mower down in them, or they're unable to mow, and you get a problem with property maintenance issues now. So I like the idea of the natives. A tailwater changed a little bit. It was always the 15-year, 20-minute receiving stream and pipe system, but with the new storm events we're using, this tailwater now that you need to consider on the pipe system. And this is a problem I see in a lot of designs that come in with detention. No one's looking at the tailwater component. You're looking at you're assuming a free outfall situation. You're neglecting the water level in the stream, in your discharging pipe. You're neglecting the hydraulic grade line in the receiving pipe system, and you're getting a backup of water into above the bottom of the basin that's affecting the amount of water that's coming out of the basin. So number one, we want these basins designed in a free outlet condition. If you can't, we have other alternatives for you, and you need to go into some additional analysis to show us that this will work. But please remember that you need to consider the tailwater. So where you're sending this water out of the basin and into the receiving stream, again, you need to make sure the bottom of the basin's above that 10-year, 24-hour receiving channel elevation. And if you're sending it through a pipe system to get there, you also need to be looking at that 15-year, 20-minute hydraulic grade line and making sure that you're in a free outfall condition. We did change our maximum ponding and freeboard condition. Our typical one was just run it with the 100-year event, and we need 2 years of freeboard from the top of the basin or the crest of an emergency spillway. We seem to be the only one in our area doing it that way. And so the only reason we changed from that was to be like all the rest of the municipalities and MSD in St. Louis County around here. So our new maximum ponding condition is based on the routing of the 100-year, 24-hour design storm, and we assume that the low flow and any intermediate flow openings are fully blocked, and that the water's already ponded to the overflow structure sill. So the overflow structure sill is the only thing taking water at that point. And then now our freeboard condition is 1 foot, not 2 feet, to the top of the dam or the emergency spillway crest. We've always required emergency spillways where offsite property or infrastructure or structures exist, and the downstream flow path of the stormwater where the basin dam would overflow. So if that basin dam has a chance of overflowing and you got structures before it can get to a stream, or you've got other property or other things that we need to be concerned about that could be damaged before that water can get back safely into a stream and be conveyed away from property and structures, then we do require an emergency spillway. We've always required that. It just was never in our design criteria. Now it's in there. So we get into section 70, and we have to have preservation and maintenance requirements. For subdivisions, these structural facilities have to be preserved in common ground, and they're going to be done on the record plat for subdivisions. In non-residential commercial sites, these will be done in easements or deed restricted areas, and then we have maintenance agreements required for those and for subdivisions. So all owners, developers will sign a maintenance agreement that's required. We have a standard form for that. I didn't put it up here, but that is on our website. And then we have a component, we have 2 exhibits that go into that requirement that right now the engineer is required to provide us, and that shows those preservation areas of those easement areas. And that also shows the maintenance requirements and the schedule for maintenance of those things. So for subdivisions, the requirement for maintenance is the HOA. They maintain those things. The developer is required to sign that maintenance agreement, and the subdivision and trust indentures and restrictions, covenants, that's where that maintenance agreement's referenced and enforced. In non-subdivision commercial, again, we've got that deed restriction and maintenance agreement, and we require that to be recorded. That's a recorded document, and that's paid for by the owner. Again, as we said, we require right now the engineer to provide a maintenance plan and schedule that's attached to that agreement as an exhibit. But for long term, the county is currently developing maintenance plan templates for each individual BMP that we're going to be describing in section 7040. So down the road, we shouldn't be needing these from engineers anymore. We should be having our own plan templates. Again, you know, we're looking at other agencies' templates for this and trying to modify these into our own. But, you know, this is something that's not going to be, this is something that's down the road. We're looking at a year or 2 out probably on something like that. But we are working towards that end right now. Again, we do require the developer or the owner to pay the recording fee to have those agreements recorded. And then we take them down and record them ourselves. And then as part of what we do, the county also, under our ordinance section 4020, we have to, we do periodic inspections of these facilities. So when the county approves the construction of these stormwater management facilities, these BMPs, that no longer, that the maintenance is no longer the onus of the contractor or the developer. The maintenance is now the owner of the property or the HOA. So we send them a little orientation packet. It's consists of a letter explaining why we're doing this, what the function of it is for. It's explaining their maintenance requirements and the county inspection process. And it's even giving them resources to do the maintenance with and for planting lists and things like that. It also strongly recommends hiring a professional to maintain these things, or using a local gardening group to do something like that. Again, I love these, I love what John was showing and what Drew was showing, and some of these really complex mixes of plants, but that's difficult for these homeowners associations to maintain. They can't tell the difference between a weed and a native. So it becomes difficult for them to maintain unless they're hiring a professional. So number one, we would like these, like I said, we'd like these to look nice, but we'd like to make these probably as simple as possible, and not use these complex planting pallets unless they've got someone that can maintain these, or they're looking for that prairie look. I mean, that makes sense in that thing. Short of that, we would like to try and keep these simple. We've gone so far in some of these orientation things to actually give these guys pictures of the plants they have in there, and pictures of plants when they're mature, and pictures of what the plants when they're first coming up, because I have a bunch of rain gardens at my house and it's a lot of work. I'm going to tell you that. These things don't happen and look nice overnight. It's a lot of work, and you got to be able to recognize the weeds from the viable plants. So we send that out. We send out, part of what's included in that is our inspection standards and our inspection form. And then we also make sure they get that maintenance agreement that's been approved for these stormwater management facilities. Performance guarantees, like I said, are also required for the construction of these facilities to assure that they get constructed properly. On commercial sites, those costs are included in the sediment and erosion control performance guarantee and released as such with that. And subdivision developments, those are just part of the subdivision improvements performance guarantee, and they're released as part of that. And you can see those sections of our ordinance that cover those releases and requirements. Again, we didn't want to create a whole new mechanism for doing this. We felt we could incorporate it into what we had and make it simple enough that way. So let's get into quickly about how we want to focus our design, or have you focus your design. And number one, again, we want to try and prevent as much runoff as possible on these sites. So if we can preserve tree canopy, if we can preserve native vegetation, if we can preserve a lot of these things that help prevent runoff in the first place, that's what we want to do. And we're going to give you credits for that. And that's going to help reduce, number one, the amount of water quality volume that you have to protect in these structural BMPs. And it's also going to reduce the amount of detention volume requirements that you have, because we're going to allow you to adjust curve numbers that way. So that's the first thing we want you to consider. And we are working on a worksheet. That's one of the things that's holding up the design process now, for you to fill out. That's going to go through these steps and have you fill out that worksheet. I think that's going to help you do the design, number one, better, and it's going to help us when we review the design and help us review it in a quicker and more expedient manner. So the first thing, let's see what we can do to preserve stuff. The second thing is, on our component for water quality, is we would like you to provide runoff reduction volume treatment to the maximum extent practicable of the site. And these are features, these are BMPs that are actually removing the volume of runoff. These are things that are evaporating runoff. These are things that are truly soaking it into the ground, although that probably isn't going to happen much in this area. These are things that are being taken up in the plants and transpiring runoff. These are things that can be held for periods of time and reused in times of drought to get the water to soak into the ground. Like I said, they've got a lot of neat complex systems now where you can have gates that are tied into computer systems, that are tied into to weather systems that can tell you when a storm's moving in and when a storm's going out, and the optimum time to release some of that runoff. And so, again, I strongly recommend the use of these new cost-effective technologies. But the more we can remove, the better we're going to be, because that water gets removed at 100% total settable solids removal. And so in that case, we only require you to address the first 0.9 inches of volume for runoff. So if you can address all of that 0.9 inches for runoff reduction volume, you don't have any further water quality volume requirement. So once you get done looking at those two things to your MEP, then we want you to address what's left for water quality volume. And these kind of facilities are required to remove 80% of TSS removal. So at that part, you're looking at the first 1.14 inches of rainfall that we need you to treat, or whatever's left of that runoff reduction volume up there. And again, we get into curve, part of this design products is we need you to look at the curve number reduction you get for credits for use of those non-structural BMPs in 1 and 2. And at that point, you can start, and actually, I probably should have had 4 in front of 3 even, because you can use those to reduce your water quality volume as well. And you can use those to reduce your detention requirements. You can look at your curve number reductions. And so number 5, now we need to design, we're required for 24 hours extended stormwater detention. Our flood protection storm now is that 10-year, 24-hour. It used to be the 2-year and 10-year. We dropped the 2-year storm event since we have this 1-year, 24-hour extended event, and we have this water quality volume requirement. We felt that the 2-year flood protection was overkill. And I think that, again, the Georgia Stormwater Manual sort of supported that thought. And then while we don't require stormwater detention for the 100-year 24-hour event, we do require those facilities to contain that event, and we require those facilities to safely convey that event to a natural point of discharge. So nothing's really changed there for us. And so for you engineers, this is about the only equations you're going to see. And this is just something that's in our design criteria. It's a chart that's in there. I know I'm running short on time here, Paul, so I'll try and get this through this part as quickly as I can. But again, we need to look at water quality volume. We need to look at channel protection. We need to look at flood protection. So, there's your components of that, and your water quality components broken up into those two. One where we're actually removing the volume of water, and number two, where we're actually just filtering it and slowly putting it back into the system cleaner than it was. And again, this is a chart that we're working on that we borrowed from the city of Wentzville. But again, more than the volume of these things, we want to make sure that they function properly. And that's more my interest. I've said that all the time when we're doing land disturbance stuff and design of sediment basins. I am so much less interested in the volume of that sediment basin than I am in how long does it take that water to go through the basin and allow that sediment to settle out. The same thing's applicable here to these facilities. We want that water moving slowly through these things. We want the water to allow the ability to drain and settle these larger sediments and the larger pollutants out of this. So it needs to have that functionality. Same thing in the sediment basins. It's important to us that we're holding that water, we're removing it from the top, we're not removing it from the bottom, so we're getting the cleanest water out from the top. We're dewatering it in time to get ready for the next storm event. And so, you can have as much or little volume as you want. All that really does is make sure how quickly you have to clean it out. It really doesn't do anything about the functionality of that basin. And so I think that we're asking you to concentrate on those things more than just providing the volume that you need. And so these BMPs must be appropriate to their soils, their hydrology, their water table, their topography, etc. Water table is a big one. So again, we're strongly encouraging these BMPs that can reduce and does the runoff reduction volume, that gets rid of the volume of water, ones that evaporate, transpire, store, and reuse over these infiltration BMPs, where we're really not getting that groundwater recharge. And we're not going to allow those infiltration BMPs in areas where they shouldn't be. So in flood-prone areas with higher water tables, these aren't appropriate there. We've installed some of these. We had one with the county doesn't have a lot of industrial area, but we had a manufacturing facility that built a trucking storage area, a trucking facility to park their trucks. Generally, they're not there more than 24 hours, but they built it in an agricultural part of the county that's in a floodplain. And of course, the first small flood event we had on the Mississippi River flooded this infiltration basin. And now essentially we don't have an infiltration basin in here. We have a modified wetland or an engineered wetland, and it still functions and it still works, but horses for courses, that wasn't the right thing in the right place. When we get in, now we're getting into our design guidelines here, and I'll try and go through this quickly, but this is the meat and potatoes. This is gonna, again, we'll get into this and we'll show you the flexibility, but we're encouraging you to design innovative ways, use cost-effective technologies that are available, use on-site recyclable materials. We're always encouraging that, and manufacturing technology. So we'll try and keep our design criterion as current as possible, but again, feel free to approach us with alternatives. We also have incorporated flexibility into our design requirements because we will allow design methods and BMPs from municipalities in St. Charles County and St. Louis Metropolitan Sewer District that are compliant with state and federal requirements. We'll allow you to use their designs as well. It may take a little longer review time for that because we may not be as familiar with them. So that's the caveat there. We'll also allow BMPs and methods from regional planning, state and federal agencies that have similar hydrology, soils, and geological conditions. And so we call out Georgia Stormwater Manual, MARC Manual, Maryland Stormwater Design Manual. Again, I'm a little more hesitant on Maryland Stormwater Manual because their soils are so much different than ours here, and their facilities seem to be more reliant on that infiltration where they can get good groundwater recharge. So we'll allow you to use those other things, but the substitution of those design methods and BMPs do not apply to our easement and ownership requirements or our maintenance requirements of these. So you still need to follow the rules of our design guidelines and our ordinance in regards to that. If you are going to use alternative methods, we ask that you let us know about that early on in the preliminary conceptual design stage of the project. We would like to be able to get up to speed on what you're going to use so we can be ready when we're doing the review of that. So we're not doing a bunch of research during our review of that project. That would be very helpful to us, and I think to you and to your client. Again, any alternative methods that we're going to allow need to meet the design standards of section 7010 and 7010.2, and they need to support those purpose statements that we went through in section 70.00.1 earlier. That is important to us. So don't give us something that's that hole in the ground that's going to hold water for 48 hours and never establish plants. That doesn't meet our purpose. Part of this section also goes through our non-structural BMPs and credits, and this is a list of all the ones that we do allow. So we give you credits for natural area conservation, sheet flow to buffer, and again, we have minimum requirements for these. So some of these you're going to have credits for anyway, just by meeting our requirements. But when you go beyond our requirements, that's how we've tried to do this. Rather than increasing our requirement for buffer protection, we're incentivizing the use of it by giving you these credits and allowing you less structural volume that's needed to be designed for these BMPs. So rather than providing more regulation, we're incentivizing the use of these non-structural things, and that was our strategy here. Site reforestation, tree canopy, or revegetation, and we're talking about those native plantings, things like John Wingo was showing us. We love that stuff. That stuff's great. You heard how much water those things can take up. I can't imagine a better BMP than that in tree canopy. So I mean that's our number one priority, is to either preserve that area or recreate those types of native areas. We have a credit for soil restoration and amendments, disconnection of rooftop runoff, disconnection of non-rooftop runoff. Generally, those are for commercial sites. We have a design for open channel that slows the water down and allows it to soak in. It's not the same as a conveyance swale. These are very different, so please read what's required of that in the design if you're considering using it. And again, we have a large environmentally sensitive development credit that probably is better used for some larger lot developments than smaller lot developments. But again, some of these will affect the volume that you can reduce for runoff reduction. Some of it will reduce the volume needed for water quality. And some of those will allow you an adjustment of timing concentration or curve number so that it will reduce your storage volume needed for your stormwater detention. We get into listing some urban structural BMPs that are allowed in this section as well. And again, we'd like to limit these as much as possible. So let's consider these after all reasonable attempts have made to minimize the stormwater runoff and maximize its control and treatment through better site design methods, use of these natural features and non-structural BMPs. I know these cost a lot. they're a burden on the property to find places in the footprint to fit them in. I think that they can be used again as an amenity to the property and the development if they're done right. And that's what we want to see when they are installed. But the fewer that we have of these, the better, as far as I'm concerned. It's going to cost you guys less in times of your engineering. It's going to cost your client less in terms of construction, and it's going to cost the people that we leave them less in terms of maintenance and time that they have to take care of these. This section also covers proprietary BMPs, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have a whole list of acceptable urban PMPs, but again, we're flexible on what we're going to use, and we have those listed by category. I'll go through those quickly. And then our design guidelines, as I said, are currently under development. So these are things that you can specifically use in the county that we know are going to meet that 80% TSS, and they're going to meet all of our requirements in section 7010. But you aren't required to use those. But those are going to be your quickest review if you're going to use our standard guidelines. So talking about proprietary BMPs, again, we have a little small list in there of what we allow to use. We're more than happy to alter that list as we move forward. But any proprietary BMP has to be approved by the director. And I can approve things off that list. It would be helpful if they were being used by other local MS4 municipalities or agencies so that we could get in touch with them to see the history of that use and how well it's working. But bottom line is any proprietary BMP that you want to use that's not on that list needs to capture and treat the required RRV or WQV in that section 7010. It needs to reduce the average load of suspended solids by 80%, and it needs to have an acceptable level of maintenance and longevity in the field. Again, there's our, we've got a whole bunch of different urban BMPs that we're going to allow for use. And we'll be flexible, so it'll go beyond this, but this is what we're listing in our design criteria. And then section 7040, this is where we will have specific design guides for specific BMPs under each one of these categories. But we have 5 categories of them: stormwater ponds, stormwater wetlands, infiltration practices, filtering practices, and open channel practices that are allowed. So this is kind of a summary of where we were and where we are now. And the old standards, essentially, like I said, we had a lot of non-structural requirements. We had buffer, and those are still all the same requirements, although we've expanded on their use by giving you credits to reduce the structural volume requirements that you have to provide. So basically our old standards, we provided overbank flood protection, and we did that for the 2-year and the 10-year 24-hour storm event. And like I said, on sites or drainage areas where we had under 10 acres of drainage, we allowed you to use that trapezoidal hydrograph and use those 20-minute storm events. So our new standards now are those nested component. We want you to be looking at preservation of natural features. We want you to be using those non-structural credit features. We want you to be using those runoff reduction features. But basically, the first thing you have to do is treat that first flush of runoff for 90% of our storm events. And that's 1.14% inches of rainfall if you're using it through water quality treatment. If you're using runoff reduction and we're actually getting rid of that water, that's that first 0.9 inches of rainfall. So we now require that in addition to our old stormwater detention. We now have a requirement for channel protection, and that's that 1-year 24-hour storm event, a 24-hour extended detention of the 1-year 24-hour storm event, and that's about 2.8 inches of rainfall. And then we still have our overbank flood protection requirement, although we've dropped that 2-year event, and we're only requiring you to address that 10-year 24-hour rainfall event. Again, when we get those larger rainfall events, you still have to accommodate that 100-year storm in your basin, get it out of your basin and safely convey it. to a natural drainage system without causing erosion issues. So kind of in pictures real quickly, here's where we were. This would be a typical dry detention in the old days in the county and a typical wet detention basin. You know, everything's mowed up right to the edge. You got that outflow structure right here that's modifying that. You may get a little bit of water quality benefit from evaporation in here, but you're basically not getting much of anything else. Goes in, goes out. So this is some of the newer stuff that you'll see. And again, the county's been doing this for a while. We've been trading off some stormwater detention requirements for these types of facilities where our owners have wanted to do that. And so these are basically some newer biofiltration facilities that have gone in the county in lieu of stormwater detention. We do not have any extended 24-hour extended stormwater detention facilities yet, but these will be some designs that we're going to allow for those. Again, it's going to be important. The size of the orifice openings are regulated in our design criteria, how you protect those orifice openings. This is going to be our preferred method where that pipe's inverted underneath the water. And that's going to help prevent that from clogging and debris. That's our concern there because those openings get so small. We're strongly encouraging, again, these nested facilities. So these are two different examples that I got from the HBA that they had proposed to MSD and that MSD is approved. On this one, the water quality component is offline where, you know, you're coming into this structure, it's diverting that first 1.14 inches of stormwater through a weir into this water quality component. You're getting the water quality component treatment, and any overflow would end up into this basin where, you know, when you got more than that 1.14 inches or whatever that flow rate was, that's going to bypass the water quality facility, get into the stormwater detention facility where you're now providing that extended stormwater detention and that traditional flood protection detention, and any overflow from water quality gets in there. So I prefer this method, but we would also allow it to all be stacked into one facility where this is all being provided into one facility. I know these slides are probably hard to see the detail of that, but these are just being provided stacked on top of each other with water quality, extended detention, and traditional detention on top of one another. So we will allow some of that extended detention storage to count for water quality volume, I believe up to 50%, but you need to read the design criteria on how we allow you to do that. And again, so this is kind of something old and new, and the one on the left, again, was just this traditional detention facility. The one on the right, I think, is something more of what we're going to want to see. Again, we've got a lot of those cattails in there that Drew doesn't like, but those can be taken care of. But there's a lot of other viable plant material in here. A lot of the green you see, there is some algae in this pond, but it's pretty clean, which is crazy because it takes a lot of rainfall from people's backyards that get fertilized all the time. But there's a lot of duckweed and stuff in here. The cool thing about this pond is this pond compared to that pond is there's so much more native habitat and wildlife in here. It had birds, it had fish, it had, you know, you might have didn't see any mosquito larvae. It had bugs on top, but, you know, it had frogs, it had minnows, it had all kinds of cool stuff. Of course, the people also complained that it had snakes and other things that they didn't like. So to each his own on this whole thing, but the preference for us would be the one on the right that's multifunctional versus the one on the left that provides one function. We also, other than water quality in that section 70, I'll go quickly through this. We did change a few other things in our design criteria. Our design criteria hadn't been updated for quite a while, even like to the point where defining the functions of the highway department versus the community development department and who makes what decisions. Recent ordinance changes where our design criteria had not been updated. So we took this opportunity to do that as well. So some definitions have changed in section 10, again, mostly to define the functions of the highway department versus the functions of the community development department. Section 20 has been revised, which is our street sections and section pavements. A couple years ago, we added a requirement to put that 4-inch rock base underneath all of our pavements. So that section's been updated, and we have new details for that. We also have created a new street section for 3-acre lot subdivisions. 3-acre lot subdivisions used to be able to build on private requirements with just gravel. These are now have to be built to public subdivision standards. However, we reduced the street width from 24 feet to 20 feet. So we have new street sections in the design criteria for that new standard. Section 30 shows our improvement plan requirements, and we added reduced requirements for our 3-acre lot subdivisions, those lower density developments. That previously was in UDO section 410, and we pulled it out of there and put it in section 30. We also updated section 410 street improvements with quite a few things just to update things from past ordinance changes. Section 50 of the storm drainage facilities, again, we now allow the use of polypropylene pipe and HDPE pipe. So we have our new standards in there. That was updated. And like I said, we pulled our old stormwater detention standards out of 5080 and put them into section 70. And then we have several new design drawings and appendices that we're still working on trying to get updated there. So apologize if I went on a little long. Again, feel free to contact me if you need a copy of the new design criteria. We do have drafts that we can give out to use. I will try and get just the draft version that is not fully updated online today. It'll be up by this week. But this is my contact information here. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, I apologize for some of the problems we've had today, and I'm anxious to get back to the live format. With that's all I have. Appreciate your time today.
Rich?
Yes, sir.
I've got one question that came up. It says, I'm sorry if I missed it, but our retention pond overflow structure is designed to release water to duplicate natural hydrograph for the watershed, or with the natural vegetation and no development? Can the outflow structures be constructed to do this?
Can you read that again?
Yeah, we're having trouble with. Can the outflow structures be designed to release water to duplicate the natural hydrograph for its watershed? Can the outflow structures be constructed to do this? So they're wanting to know if we can meet the natural flow, the original hydrograph.
Basically the way our criteria is written is yes, we're encouraging you to mimic the hydrograph of the natural water course. It's not required, but that's what our encouragement is. And I think our priority to try and preserve these areas or use non-structural things to recreate these areas and soak water into the ground goes hand in hand with that type of thing. But it is not a specific requirement if that's what the question's getting at. But yes, absolutely, that's how we want you to design these.